Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
Accident investigators have to rely on physical evidence when they analyze a crash. Sometimes there are no eyewitnesses, and even when there are, they may not be a reliable source of objective information. They're people, and whether they're drivers or some independent witness, they may have a distorted perspective on the crash. They may not have seen the whole thing, they may even be in shock. They may also be trying to hide something, and that's what Joe Hancock's gonna have to figure out in this complicated case.
It's a warm summer evening on a quiet country road, and 28-year-old Jan Taylor is slowly regaining consciousness. Surveying the scene, it's clear he's been in an accident, but the details are still fuzzy. As he gets out of his car, he remembers that he was not alone in the vehicle. His friend Carl Weinberger was in the passenger seat, but suddenly he's disappeared. Searching the tall weeds along the roadside, he eventually stumbles upon the still body of his longtime friend, lying in a shallow ditch several meters into the brush. Accident reconstructionist Joe Hancock is immediately called in to head up the investigation. Joe quickly learns that he's got one dead passenger on his hands and an injured driver. It's clear that Carl Weinberger was ejected through the passenger window and most likely died on impact. The driver, Jan Taylor, suffered only minor injuries, but is sent to the hospital for overnight observation.
When I get a call for a single vehicle crash, based on my experience, I'm expecting to see one car into either a tree, a wall, a guardrail, with one set of skid marks, left side and right side, that don't cross each other. And looking at the roadway, there are numerous tire marks, scuff marks, curve marks, change direction marks, and debris in the roadway.
As Joe inspects the car, he is immediately able to rule out a single vehicle accident. Behind the rear wheel on the driver's side is a long rip. The metal has been peeled back, and the rear bumper has been partially ripped off.
In this vehicle, I noticed severe damage along the driver's side of the car, basically starting from the B pillar, the pillar right behind the driver's door, and going back towards the rear bumper. I also noticed that the rear bumper was bent backwards towards the rear of the vehicle. And looking at the car, I saw that there was a paint transfer on the car. There was some red paint transfer. And also in looking at the damage, I noticed that the damage was from a movement going front to rear.
Now, Joe is certain he's looking for a second vehicle. This is a clear case of hit and run. In a hit and run, every mark, every piece of roadway debris becomes a potential clue. He knows right away that he's looking for a red car, and because of the extent of the damage, it must have been a larger vehicle. Surveying the site for more clues, he finds another piece of the puzzle, one that confirms his theory about the second vehicle.
I noticed a large pool of fluid on the ground. And looking at the fluid, it appeared to be diesel fuel. I noticed that it then, from the pool, led off in a trail, and it led down the road.
This fuel leak is a tremendous stroke of luck, and Joe immediately orders a trooper to follow the diesel trail. At the trail's end, he finds a truck, parked behind a gas station, about 30 kilometers away from the crash site. He calls in the plate number and is told that the truck is registered to James Higgins.
They found out that the vehicle belonged to Mr. Higgins, and his address was very close by to that location.
James Higgins is at home when the officers arrive. He doesn't deny being in a crash. In fact, he admits to panicking and fleeing the scene. But he's not able to recall any details of the crash. He just remembers hitting something. On first blush, the case looks like a cut-and-dry case of a DWI hit-and-run, and James Higgins could be facing serious criminal charges.
They told me that Mr. Higgins had admitted to being in the crash, but that he had panicked at the crash and went home. And when he got home, he was so upset that he had started to consume alcohol to calm his nerves. The officers, of course, were suspicious and then brought him into the station.
But then, a brief update from the hospital suddenly turns Joe's case upside down. The officer who accompanied Jan Taylor to the hospital calls in with a different statement. Jan is claiming that he was hit from behind and spun out. But this doesn't make any sense to Joe. The damage to Jan's car indicates that he was struck by a vehicle coming from the opposite direction. certainly not from behind.
I would expect to see damage to the rear of the vehicle going rear to front and into the trunk compartment itself. I didn't see that on this car. What I saw on this car was a sideswipe type of impact from the front to the rear. Already I'm starting to think, well, the damage doesn't match up that closely.
But why would Jan Taylor say differently?
He has been just through a very traumatic experience. He has lost a friend. He could be confused, he could be disoriented, or he could be lying.
In his statement, Jan Taylor claims that his car spun around and his friend was thrown out. Joe knows this much to be true. The body of Carl Weinberger was found only a few meters from the impact marks. But Joe has a feeling that Jan's not telling the whole story. Whenever a driver's statement conflicts with the evidence, the crash scene takes priority. Joe turns his attention back to the roadway, and that's when he notices the collision scuff marks.
There was a scuff mark indicating that a vehicle had slid sideways and rotated before the impact.
The roadway evidence clearly shows the car suddenly veering to the left and skidding to a complete stop across both lanes. Then there's a major impact, probably with the truck. The arced marks show that he then spins out again and back towards his lane, at which point his passenger, Carl Weinberger, is thrown from the vehicle. This is a critical finding because it says to Joe that the car was out of control before the collision. But Jan Taylor's saying something else.
Some of the considerations that are still on the table is that this is a crash that involves being struck from the rear. Right now, the physical evidence is not leaning that way, but I have not observed everything, and I haven't done all the analysis necessary to come to that conclusion. And speaking with Mr. Taylor, I'm really hoping to get more information about this crash to help me with my investigation.
Joe heads over to the hospital to interview Jan Taylor. He first examines Weinberger's medical report. It's a tragic scenario that Joe has seen all too often.
The passenger, Carl Weinberger, had died of massive head injuries. These head injuries were as a result of bouncing into the grass. The passenger was not seatbelted. The lateral gravitational forces of the spin caused him to go out the passenger window and fall on the ground. That's what killed him.
Typically, the patients that we see that are ejected from cars are among the most severely injured patients that we have. Most of them have severe head injuries, and those are coupled with severe, typically orthopedic injuries, broken bones, broken legs, and that is also coupled by blunt injuries to your liver and your spleen. So those patients are the ones that we worry about the most. The ones that we don't worry about are the ones that are in the car who have their seatbelts on. Those patients are much less severely injured.
When Joe finds Jan Taylor, he's still recovering from shock and has a nasty bruise on his chest. The bruise explains why he'd survived the accident. He'd been wearing his seatbelt. It's unfortunate that he hadn't convinced his friend Carl Weinberger to do the same. Joe asks Jan to go over the crash for him one more time.
I did notice when I started talking with him that he told me the same story that I had heard over the phone. I'm a crash reconstructionist. I wanted to make sure that he did understand that this crash did involve a fatality, and he did know that his friend had passed away. And speaking with him, I noticed a couple of things. One, his speech was slightly slurred, but this could be due to injury, but I wanted to make sure. But I also noticed his eyes were a little glassy, and that also there was a strong odor of an alcoholic beverage on his breath. If a driver is involved in a crash that results in a fatality, that driver must submit to a blood alcohol test.
Joe decides to wait for the results of the blood test before speaking to Jan any further. Although he suspects that Jan Taylor is hiding something, he doesn't know what or why. To find out more about the crash and Jan's statements, Joe heads over to the impound to begin his inspection of the truck. Jan Taylor's car is involved in a horrific hit and run. Police trace the missing vehicle and the driver, James Higgins, to his home. Higgins admits he left the scene of the crash and immediately started drinking, but he doesn't remember much beyond that. Jan Taylor claims that Higgins' truck hit him from behind. But the evidence shows accident investigator Joe Hancock that Taylor's car got sideswiped, and a set of skid marks suggest that the car was already out of control at the moment of the impact. As the next step, Joe heads over to the garage to inspect the impounded truck.
There was very little or any indication of impact at all to the front bumper. There were still bugs on the front bumper. If nothing else, the impact would have wiped away the dirt and the bugs off the front bumper. I then walked around the truck, trying to look for any other damage, and on the driver's side, I did find a very long scrape and a series of scrapes down the side of the truck. The scrapes had paint transfer from a greenish type vehicle. Also looking at the scrape, I noticed that in the middle of the scrape, there was actually a perforation of the side of the truck. And looking at that and looking underneath the truck, I saw that it actually punctured the fuel tank. This truck does use diesel fuel. It is starting to match up step by step by step, item by item.
Meanwhile, James Higgins is being interrogated by a detective. Despite his spotty memory about the actual crash, he may hold the key to some unanswered questions.
Mr. Higgins told us that he was driving down the road and that this vehicle now cuts him off. He has to steer to the right. There's an impact, and yes, he does leave the scene.
Higgins' story syncs up with Joe's opinion that the accident could not have been the result of a strike from behind, and he adds one important fact. He now admits that he was under the influence of alcohol when the crash occurred.
Yes, he is consuming alcohol, and that could affect his memory, but the physical evidence is supporting what he told me.
Given all the evidence and testimony so far, Joe believes the scenario could have only played out one way. Jan Taylor lost control of his car. He then steered to the right, but overreacted, trying to regain control and spun out counterclockwise into the path of the oncoming truck.
As each step of this investigation revealed what really happened, each time it convinced me that Mr. Taylor's version of this crash was inaccurate.
If Joe's new theory is correct, it would be a critical turning point for the investigation, as it suggests that Jan Taylor, rather than Higgins, could be held responsible for the accident. Next, dispatch informs Joe that Taylor has been discharged from the hospital, but that his blood test revealed he was over the legal alcohol limit. With this new information, Joe heads to Jan Taylor's house to question him once again.
Meeting Mr. Taylor at his house, I then asked him a series of questions, and also I let him know that I knew the results of the blood test and I knew that he had been drinking. In speaking with him, I wanted to know how much alcohol he had to drink and maybe try to convince him that I knew that alcohol was a factor in this case. And in talking with him at his house, he then admitted that he had been drinking and that he had been drinking a couple glasses of beer and that he also might have had a shot of hard liquor.
After 20 days of investigative work, Officer Joe Hancock now feels he has a clear picture of what really happened the day of this tragic collision.
Appreciate it, okay?
Jan Taylor and Carl Weinberger are on their way home from a bar when Jan suddenly loses control of his vehicle and spins out. James Higgins is also driving under the influence. He sees Jan Taylor's car and steers to avoid it, but manages to catch the side rear end of the car, sending it spinning like a top. The impact causes Carl Weinberger, who was not wearing his seatbelt, to go flying out through the passenger window. He then lands hard in a ditch next to the roadway and succumbs almost instantly to head trauma and massive internal injuries. James Higgins, in a panic, takes off but leaves a trail of leaking diesel fuel from a rip in his gas tank. The state attorney's office looks at the case and agrees that James Higgins is not responsible for the incident. He's charged only with fleeing the scene of a crash. The state attorney suspects that Jan Taylor had been drinking, lost control, and spun out into oncoming traffic. Taylor is charged with manslaughter by automobile and homicide by motor vehicle while intoxicated. However, the jury finds Jan Taylor not guilty and acquits him on all charges.
What helped me in this case is that I talked with the family of Carl Weinberger. I talked with the prosecutors. And yes, we answer their questions.
While the investigators were able to paint a detailed picture of the accident, the prosecution's case against Taylor was unsuccessful.
Sometimes accident investigators come to a realization that a case they're working on may never be resolved. That's frustrating for the investigator. Moreover, how do you explain to a grieving mother you may never be able to tell her all about the death of her child? That's the kind of situation our investigator, Robert Jones, is dealing with here.
Maureen Weller is in a fantastic mood. She's just finished her first week on the job as a house painter, and this morning she's learned that she's been accepted into her top choice of colleges. The money she earns on this summer job will help pay for the tuition in the fall. As she packs away her tools for the day, a coworker asks Maureen if she wants to stay for a drink.
Come have a beer. Come on, have a beer.
She joins them on the balcony for a few swigs of cold beer.
Yes.
But Maureen's been feeling tired all week and is eager to celebrate with her parents before she crashes for the night. She takes one last sip and heads out.
Tomorrow, you go.
20 minutes later, police get a call about a car lodged up against a tree in the middle of a field. But the responding officer could never be prepared for the bizarre and shocking scene that awaits him. Maureen is unconscious and has been impaled by a branch. She's still alive, but her pulse is very faint.
And Johnson, Mayfair and Johnson, EMS requested, stat.
Accident investigator Robert Jones is immediately called to the scene.
The police department advised me that a branch had gone through the windshield of the car and the firefighter had to cut the branch away from the girl's neck.
The medics are not optimistic. They think the branch may have severed one of Maureen's arteries and she's lost a tremendous amount of blood. Robert's job is to figure out exactly how and why this freakish accident occurred. His first step is to carefully examine Maureen's car.
I walked around to the front of the car to examine the front of the car. It was lodged up against a tree. There was some minor impact damage to the front of the car, but it didn't lead to any kind of significant speed or anything of that nature.
Maureen's car has left a clear imprint of its final moments. Robert can see where she left the road, traveled into the field, and made contact with two separate trees. But what puzzles him most is that there doesn't appear to be any signs of braking or skidding.
The thing going through my mind at this point is what caused this girl to run off the road. I didn't know at this point whether she had been drinking, using drugs, if she fell asleep. It was extremely hot this day. It was 102 degrees. The extreme heat outside can clearly make someone tired.
But it's 6 p.m. It seems unlikely that sleep or alcohol would affect a driver so early in the evening. Robert needs to find more clues to form a theory about what could have happened. He now looks at the larger picture of the crash site. He walks back along the road looking for anything that might help explain why Maureen lost control of her vehicle. But the road gives nothing away. There's no indication of roadway debris or that another vehicle was involved in the crash.
There was no evidence on this vehicle whatsoever that she had been impacted or sideswiped by another vehicle.
Robert starts to get a sinking feeling that finding out why Maureen's car left the road will be a serious challenge. So far, he has absolutely no clues.
I had nothing to go on at this point. This girl just ran off the road for no reason.
Robert asks for the car to be impounded. He'll want to check for any mechanical failure that could explain the crash. Then, just as he is finishing up with the crash scene, Robert receives a call from the hospital. He isn't surprised to hear the news.
I received a phone call from the hospital advising me that Maureen had died from the injuries to her neck caused by the branch severing her neck.
Since there are no forensic clues, Robert requests a blood test and a full toxicology report on Maureen's body. He needs to determine whether she was under the influence of alcohol or drugs prior to the accident. Then he's faced with the tragic task of informing Mrs. Weller that her daughter is dead.
This is the most difficult part of the job, letting the relative know that their loved one has died. I never know what to expect. You know, I don't know if they're going to be angry or just not even believe.
As soon as Maureen's mother opens the door, she knows that something is wrong. This is not the first time she's had a policeman come knocking at her door with terrible news.
Yes, I am.
Maureen's mother was devastated by the tragic news. And when I tried to explain to her a little bit about what happened in the accident, for what little that I knew at that time, Maureen's mother informed me that she had lost a son about 3 years ago in an auto accident.
No.
That was very difficult to deal with.
Mrs. Weller is grief-stricken and unable to provide Robert with much more information than he already knows. Maureen was simply on her way home from work.
I'll call you in a few days and...
Unfortunately, Robert is in a similar predicament.
Findings. What made it even more difficult at this point was that I didn't have any answers for Mrs. Weller.
After a full crash scene investigation, Robert is no further ahead on this case than he'd been at the start. What could have caused a young, healthy woman to just drive her car off the road? Surely she saw the trees, but why hadn't she tried to avoid them? Accident investigator Robert Jones is faced with a mysterious and strange crash site. On the way home from work, Maureen Weller suddenly veered into a tree, impaling her neck and severing a major artery. Unable to survive almost total blood loss, she dies within the hour. But why did Maureen's car leave the road in the first place?
At this point, I have no answers in my investigation. I'm still looking for any clue that could lead me to what happened here. My next step is to go to the garage and conduct what I call a vehicle autopsy. I will examine the vehicle from top to bottom, look for any kind of mechanical failures, anything that could give me some answers in this investigation.
But the only information that Robert can take away from the mechanical inspection is the approximate speed and the fact that Maureen was not wearing her seatbelt. This opens up another possibility. Maybe the crash was deliberate.
Anytime there's a single car accident, such as this one, and the driver is killed, I always have to consider suicide.
Robert will need to meet again with Mrs. Weller to see if he can gather more background information on her daughter. This second meeting is calmer but still heartbreakingly sad. Mrs. Weller tells Robert that Maureen was a happy girl. She had many friends, had been accepted into the university of her choice, and was excited to spend the summer working at the house painting job. She had no medical problems and was certainly not suicidal. She tells Robert that if Maureen ever drank, it was the occasional beer. Not only because she was underage, it just wasn't who she was.
She informed me that Maureen had just taken a job painting houses for a painting company. So I'm gonna find out what her condition was during the course of the day to see if there's anything they can tell me about this investigation.
Robert drives to the work site and Maureen's bosses are stunned by the news. His first question is whether she had been drinking before she left for home. They tell Robert that they ended their shift with a beer, but insist that Maureen only drank a few sips.
So now my investigation reveals that Maureen wasn't depressed. She wasn't taking any kind of drugs or medication. There's that possibility that maybe she had a little alcohol, but she wasn't a heavy drinker. Normally in an accident investigation, there's physical evidence there. There's everything you need to put the pieces back together and put the puzzle back together. And everything usually fits. You usually have all the answers within a few days. But in this case, I don't.
By now, it's 5 p.m. in the afternoon, about the same time that Maureen left her job the day before. Robert decides to head back out to the crash site. As he examines the scene a second time, Robert realizes that the sun may have blinded Maureen and could be a factor in this case.
I walked around and I started thinking, wow, the sun's shining in the windshield of the car. It's a possibility, and it's something I'm considering at this point.
Okay, so you're driving down the road and the sun's really bright in your eyes. What do? Well, you can start with sunglasses. Sunglasses are good help, but that's not enough. The sun's really low. How about the visor? Now that makes it so you can see. Could the sun have played a role in this crash? Could it have blinded a lady when she went into the tree? It's possible. Robert's going to have to consider that as one of his explanations in this crash.
The next morning, Robert returns to the hospital for the toxicology report. As he suspected, there is no evidence to suggest that Maureen was impaired.
There was no drugs, no medication, just the slightest bit of alcohol, which would indicate that she only had a few sips of beer. But there was something that caught my attention on the report. It was an EBV virus, and it was puzzling to me. I had to find out what that was.
Epstein-Barr virus it's like a lot of diseases. There's different ways it's expressed. And one of the common things it causes is mononucleosis. And it's something that teenagers get a lot because you generally don't develop it unless you're run down to begin with. And it starts out with a sore throat. You really can't stay awake. It's something you could easily ignore until you really are very ill.
This is a stunning revelation. A person suffering from mononucleosis would have a much greater likelihood of falling asleep behind the wheel and not waking up once the car went off the road.
When I found out what EBV was, mononucleosis, which is a sleeping sickness, finally, the final piece of the puzzle fit together and the whole investigation has been concluded.
After a difficult 10-day investigation, Robert can now paint a clear picture of the events leading up to Maureen's fatal and tragic crash. Probably a week or so before Maureen Weller receives her college admission letter, she contracts the EBV virus. Her new job painting houses is hard physical labor outside in the burning sun, and she puts down her increasing sense of fatigue to the long hours. But on that final day, the virus takes hold of her weary body completely. On the drive home, the sunshine acts as a powerful sedative for Maureen, coupled with her long day and a few sips of beer after work. She nods off at the wheel and quickly falls into such a deep sleep that even when her car rolls off the roadway, she doesn't wake up. She hits a tree and one of the branches severs her carotid artery. Maureen Weller dies within an hour from almost total blood loss. Mrs. Weller remains devastated by the loss of her young daughter, but she takes some comfort in finally putting to rest the questions surrounding her untimely death.
Once I found out about the mononucleosis, I had the answer I was looking for. I was able to go back to Mrs. Weller and tell her what my findings were and what caused this collision to occur.
A good accident investigator is kind of like a jack of all trades. He needs to have good police investigative skills, have some understanding of some of the basic sciences like physics and mechanics, but he's also got to understand a little bit about medicine, because we know crashes can injure people, but can work the other way around. Sometimes the human factor and something about the body can lead to a crash.
On a hot summer morning, Donald Morris takes the scenic route home from church. His friend Valerie is following in her car behind him. Donald has invited her over for lunch, but decides to stop at a neighboring farm first to buy some fresh corn. Just up the road, Danny Carlton is helping his dad out for the summer.
Here you go, sir.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Traffic is normally heavier on the weekend, so Danny is expecting a busy day. But Danny could have never expected what would happen next. Accident investigator Frank Carson is on his way to the office when he gets the call about a pedestrian crash. Before he joined the police 9 years earlier, Frank spent 8 years working as an EMS personnel, so he knows all too well how devastating this type of collision can be.
When a car hits a pedestrian, you've got a 40,000-pound vehicle hitting a 150-pound person, and the winner's usually pretty clear.
When Frank arrives on the scene, Danny Carlton has already been taken to the hospital. The responding officer tells Frank that the victim has suffered some head injuries and serious trauma to his chest. But as an accident investigator, Frank knows that injury analysis is only one part of his job. He will need to scrutinize every aspect of the crash in order to determine exactly what happened here.
What the officer told me was he had two witnesses. One was walking down the street when the accident occurred, and the other one was driving behind Mr. Morris. He told me that Mr. Morris's car had run into the corn for sale stand, and that's about all I had to start out with.
Frank soon realizes that the corn stand has been completely destroyed by Morris's car, which now sits on top of the crushed table. A few meters away, Donald and Valerie are sitting on the lawn. The officer tells Frank that the uninjured Morris has remained surprisingly calm since he got out of his car and has barely said a word.
People's reactions after they're in a crash vary from person to person.
You Donald?
But they're generally pretty easy to offer what happened in the crash.
Do me a favor, Valerie. Could you go over and stand by your car?
When I interviewed Donald Morris, he seemed a little bit out of it, but it didn't strike me as being from alcohol or drugs. He was confused. He answered my questions, but kind of had to pull the answers out of him by asking the appropriate questions.
The interview plods along at a slow pace. Donald tells Frank that he remembers seeing the corn sign. But after that point, he claims he doesn't recall anything until his friend started knocking on his car window.
I'm sure he was in shock from having been in a crash, but his behavior just seemed a little bit different from what I'd seen in the past.
Then, as part of his routine line of questioning, Frank asks Donald whether he's taking any medication.
Mr. Morris was very surprising in that he knew a lot about the medication he was taking, and he knew the names. He could describe them in detail.
When Frank recognizes the type of medication Morris has to take daily, he immediately realizes that his investigation has taken a turn in an uncommon direction. When he questions Donald about his condition, Morris calmly confirms to him that he is schizophrenic.
Schizophrenia is one of a collection of conditions called psychotic disorders. A psychosis is a condition where someone loses their ability to distinguish what's real from what is unreal. And a person with schizophrenia generally has hallucinations that they hear, voices. There may be things that they see, but any of the senses may be affected.
Feeling pretty good?
Yeah.
But like many other people living with his condition, Morris holds a valid and unrestricted driver's license.
What's the last thing you remember before all this?
In most jurisdictions, schizophrenics are considered to be safe drivers, given, of course, that their condition is correctly medicated. As an officer escorts Morris to a police car, Frank turns his attention to the witnesses. He starts with Valerie Barker, Donald's friend.
Valerie told me that she had been following Mr. Morris, and she said that he had been driving just fine for several miles, and suddenly when they got towards the corn stand, he just seemed to veer off the road. She didn't see any brake lights. As soon as the crash occurred, Valerie got out of her car and went over to see if she could help anybody. And when she went to Mr. Morris's car, he was wearing a seatbelt. He was slumped over in his seat, seemed to be groggy, and just like he had just woken up and didn't know what was going on and what had happened to him.
Listen, Donald, try to get out of the car, okay?
Where were you?
However, the customer's account of the accident is a little different. The man tells Frank that he heard Donald's car accelerate, then saw him drive directly towards the corn stand. The customer insists that Morris made no attempt to avoid the stand. In fact, he doesn't think the crash was an accident at all.
That was his impression of the crash, that he did it on purpose.
After this revelation, Frank is faced with one very odd possibility.
Some possible explanations for the crash could include auditory hallucinations that tell the person to kill or hurt someone else.
Could Donald Morris's condition have caused him to run over Danny Carlton deliberately? Morris does not seem to be paranoid or aggressive at all. He insists that he is very disciplined at taking his medication and that he has not experienced a psychotic episode in many years.
Mr. Morris was actually a very cooperative driver, one of the more cooperative ones I've dealt with.
With witnesses offering conflicting versions of the crash, Frank turns his attention to the roadway evidence. The final resting point of Donald's car tells Frank that he was probably traveling well within the speed limit. But the absence of tire marks on the asphalt confirms that Donald made no attempt to avoid the collision.
Usually when drivers lose control of their vehicle or not paying attention, go off the road and either use their brakes or swerve because no one wants to hit something while they're driving a car. But he didn't exhibit that kind of behavior.
As he wraps up his investigation at the scene, Frank receives an important phone call from the hospital.
I received a phone call from the hospital about an hour after I was on the scene. The hospital personnel told me Danny Carlton had in fact died from the injuries that he sustained in the crash.
How long ago?
When Donald's car violently collided with the corn stand, the force was transmitted directly through the table and into Danny's chest, resulting in massive internal injuries. A few minutes after arriving at the hospital, Danny Carlton dies from internal bleeding.
Not that any crash isn't important to investigate, but now someone's life has been lost. And so that puts a little bit more pressure on you as an investigator to find out exactly how the crash happened, why it happened. First of all, did Mr. Morris do it on purpose? The other possibility is he had a blackout, maybe a reaction from the medication he was taking, maybe he wasn't taking his medication properly. And because Mr. Morris is being at fault for the collision, at least at this point, well, he could be facing some pretty serious charges.
A boy is killed when a car leaves the road and crashes into the corn stand he's attending. Investigator Frank Carson learns that the driver is schizophrenic and suspects that the cause of the crash may have something to do with his condition. When the first paramedics arrived on the scene, Donald Morris refused medical assistance. But now, Frank notices a small laceration on his nose.
It didn't look like it was brand new. It looked like it was about a day old. So then I'm thinking that maybe he had some kind of trauma the day before.
When Frank questions him about his nose, Donald explains that he had slipped the day before and hit his face on the kitchen counter.
And I asked him why he fell, if he tripped over something. He said no, he just kind of felt dizzy and he fell, and the next thing he remembered, he was getting up off the floor. So that leads me to think at this point that, okay, maybe he has an underlying medical condition that made him fall the day before, and maybe he's having that same problem today.
In order to sort through the possible causes for the crash, Frank convinces Donald to seek medical treatment and accompanies him to the closest ER. At the hospital, Donald Morris is admitted right away and seen by Dr. Vanessa Brown. The doctor quickly orders a blood test. She wants to check for the presence of alcohol or drugs in the suspect's system. But in order to rule out the other possible causes for the crash, a number of other tests will have to be run.
One of the more important things I wanted to see from the blood tests was to check and see if Mr. Morris's medication that he was supposed to be taking for his mental problems was at a nice therapeutic level, meaning he was taking his medication the way he's supposed to, and they were doing what they were supposed to, keep him emotionally and psychologically level and able to function properly.
Since he had fallen the day before in his kitchen, Morris undergoes a CT scan to rule out the possibility that any head injury may have caused his strange behavior. In the meantime, Frank meets with Dr. Brown to discuss the results of the blood test that just came in.
Well, the test showed that the medication level in his bloodstream was appropriate, and he hadn't been consuming any alcohol or any other drugs that might impair his driving.
Those results rule out a psychotic episode, and Frank is inclined to dismiss the deliberate hit theory. On her side, Dr. Brown rules out the possibility that there was a complication with one of Donald's prescriptions. None of the drugs he was on were known to cause blackouts.
The doctor was of the opinion that Mr. Morris was just pretending that he didn't remember anything because he had hit a pedestrian, he had killed somebody, and he just didn't want to accept responsibility for that. I disagreed with that, just based on my experience and dealing with people for the years I have. I just had the impression there's something else going on.
Mr. Morris.
Frank goes back to Donald Morris to ask whether he can remember anything else about the crash. But the more Frank talks to him, the more he's convinced that Morris is not lying about the blackout.
Have the doctors looked at that and everything? The doctor thought that he was just lying to me, but when people lie, their stories tend to change a little bit over time. Little details change, but Mr. Morris's story had been consistent. Every time I talked to him, he told me the exact same story, as did the witnesses, which led me to believe that there's just got to be something else going on here.
What did your test show? Anything?
Frank then tries to convince Dr. Brown to refer Donald to a neurologist for more tests. It's not an easy task. Dr. Brown informs him that Morris's CT scan revealed no abnormality and that she could find no medical grounds to explain the crash. But Frank is persistent and pushes hard for the referral.
I explained to Dr. Brown that this man was facing very serious charges, motor vehicle manslaughter charges that can carry a very heavy penalty in jail time. And it was my responsibility to do a thorough investigation and rule in or rule out the possibility of a medical problem.
Can you run it?
Okay, we'll run.
Finally, the doctor agrees to schedule a full neurological exam for the next day, and Donald Morris is admitted overnight.
Hi, how are you doing?
The following morning, Frank arrives at the hospital and meets again with Donald Morris.
I told Mr. Morris that there may be some other tests that he's going to go through to help tell whether or not he had a medical condition and what may have caused his blackout. He claims he blacked out, so we can run some tests, hopefully, to see what caused that, if indeed he did black out.
In one of the tests, Donald is laid on a table as it is tilted up and down at timed angles to monitor his blood pressure and pulse. The test is performed to detect a rare disorder that can have an effect over a person's blood pressure. If Donald Morris has this condition, this could confirm his version that he had suffered an unexpected blackout just before the crash. Frank waits anxiously outside the exam room. When Dr. Brown comes out with the results, Frank breathes a sigh of relief. His intuition and determination have paid off.
Donald Morris, after the TIL test, was diagnosed with having neurocardiac syncope. It's also known as neurogenic syncope.
Neurogenic syncope is an extremely rare cardiovascular problem that has no relation whatsoever to Donald Morris's schizophrenia. With the diagnosis in hand, Frank can finally replay the events that led to Danny Carlton's tragic death. On a hot summer morning, Donald Morris is driving his car back from church while his friend Valerie follows closely behind. Suddenly, due to a medical condition Donald wasn't aware of, his brain sends a false message to his heart, resulting in a sudden drop in his blood pressure. As Donald passes out, his car leaves the road and heads straight for the corn stand. Danny Carlton suffers massive internal injuries and dies an hour later in the hospital.
Donald! Donald! Are you okay?
Unaware of what has just happened, Donald slowly regains consciousness with no memory of the accident.
This is a very interesting case, a very special case. First of all, we have cases where people driving their cars drive off the road, run into a tree, and they're killed in the crash. But we never know exactly what made them run off the road and run into that tree. The interesting part about this is that we were able to find out exactly what caused Mr. Morris's problem. Mr. Morris had an undiagnosed and unknown medical condition to him.
As a result of Frank's investigation, no criminal charges were filed against Donald Morris. And when Frank advised Danny Carlton's family of the cause of the crash, they also decided not to pursue a lawsuit.
So he was not prosecuted. And ultimately, although it was a tragic case, somebody did die. I think that was probably the right decision to make for Mr. Morris and for everybody involved.
When you're working a crash scene, things aren't always the way they appear at first blush. Sometimes accident investigators have to give that crash scene a second, maybe a third look to get all the facts together. And that's what Frank had to do in this case. We can take that lesson to our own heart when we're driving. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Maybe you have to give something a second look. Drive safely.
Every year, violent collisions kill 40,000 Americans and injure another 3 million. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
All too often, we forget that driving's not a right, it's a privilege. You may have paid for your car, your insurance, your license, but that doesn't mean you own the road. So when you're driving and you're not in complete control of your faculties, that's just reckless. And when I'm talking about your faculties, I mean more than alcohol and drugs. I'm talking about if you're supposed to wear glasses when you drive and you choose not to wear them, then you get in a wreck. Whose fault do you figure that is? Bottom line, alcohol, drugs, speeding, those aren't the only ways to end up facing a reckless driving charge or worse.
After a long day behind the wheel of his truck, Michael Morgan is getting tired and sleepy. It's about 70 miles to the next truck stop, and Morgan thinks that's a bit too far to risk driving any further. The trouble is, it's illegal to stop for a rest on the roadway. If he's caught, he could face a hefty fine. But given how heavy his eyelids are getting, Morgan decides to pull over and take a break for just a few minutes on a lightly traveled stretch of side road. He knows that almost 40% of truck accidents involve a sleepy driver, and he doesn't want to become a statistic. It's a decision Morgan will regret for the rest of his life. Barbara Shriver and her daughter Brooke are in a festive mood coming back from the movies. But the mood quickly shifts to panic and fear when Barbara notices a car zigzagging and coming up from behind at full speed.
Mom, what's going on? Mom.
In a matter of seconds, it catches up with them. And before they know what's happened, Barbara has lost control of her car. Up ahead, Michael Morgan's tractor-trailer comes into view, but it's too late. The Shriver smashed directly into the rear end at almost 60 miles per hour.
I received a call. They have an accident down here. Car into the back of a tractor trailer. Second vehicle involved aside from the tractor trailer, and there may be a fatality involved.
When accident investigator Frank Carson arrives at the collision scene, regular officers have blocked the street and secured the area. Barbara and Brooke have already been pulled out of their wrecked car and are on their way to the hospital. Barbara is in critical condition. She suffered a lot of head trauma and has bleeding under one of the membranes that protects the brain. She's also suffered bruises on her lungs. As for Brooke, she's luckier, having escaped with a broken arm, nose, and facial cuts. The car that came up from behind the Shrivers has been pulled over too, and Michael Morgan is also still on the scene, uninjured but numb from what just happened.
And all of a sudden, I hear boom. Get out of the vehicle.
The collision took place on a straight road under a clear sky, so there is no obvious explanation for this tragic event. Frank will have to figure out this one from scratch. But looking at the car under the truck, he immediately realizes why Barbara Shriver is fighting to stay alive. She was not wearing her seatbelt.
The passenger side of the vehicle was largely intact. The passenger compartment, the inside of the car where the passenger sat, was very little damage, and of course what helped the passenger immensely was the fact that the passenger was wearing a seatbelt.
The fact that the daughter survived this crash was due to her having worn her seatbelt and the airbags deploying. While airbags can cause some minor injuries, they're going to save more lives than they're going to take them. The deal is airbags and seatbelts go together. Airbags are a supplemental restraint to the use of seatbelts. Here's a couple of facts from a guy that's got 805. Make that 806 crashes under my seatbelt. An airbag deploys at about 200 miles an hour right near the steering wheel and the dash. And if you're not wearing a seatbelt, that's a lot of force you can hit with your upper body and with no restriction, no limits. Even when you're wearing a seatbelt, you can still suffer some abrasions on the inside of your arms from the rough airbag material itself. And in some cases, you can even break your wrist. Why is that? Because you could throw your arms up in front of your face like our pal the dummy here. This action can cause further damage, like broken noses and even broken arms. Hey, but you think those injuries are bad. Imagine how they'd be without seatbelts and airbags. Remember to buckle up.
Seat bags and airbags aside, what the Shrivers have experienced is one of the most deadly and violent collisions possible, what police call an underride.
Well, this bar that we're looking at here is called an underride protection bar. The truck drivers commonly call it an ICC bar because it's mandated by federal law. What it's designed to do is to keep the car from running underneath the tractor trailer. And if the car has a blunt front end, it works pretty well. Unfortunately, the modern vehicles are getting more aerodynamic, more low to the ground, more wedge shape, and they tend to run underneath the ICC bar. Rides underneath it, the ICC bar ends up in the passenger compartment and injuring the drivers and passengers a little bit more.
At this point, Frank Carson knows the obvious. The Shrivers' car crashed into the back of the truck. The question now is why? Frank's focus shifts to other physical evidence, the tire marks. There are plenty of those in this case, and they are giving a pretty clear picture of what happened in the final few seconds before the Shrivers slammed into the back of the trailer at high speed.
One of the first things I noticed when I got there was there were two tire marks leading in an arc from one of the lanes in the roadway right underneath the tractor trailer. So the first thing you know is that at some point, because the tire marks are in an arc, that the driver of the vehicle lost control for some reason. But there were two other tire marks that belonged to the third vehicle, and those marks led from what was the point of impact to the place where the vehicle came to a final rest.
There is a third car stopped at the scene, and it could offer clues to what happened. Frank goes to examine it.
The third car had very little damage to the front end. Very intact, could have started the car up and driven it away if you needed to.
That third car belongs to Denise French.
Ma'am, are you okay?
According to the police officer who first arrived at the crash, French was acting very strangely. She was eerily calm and seemed completely detached from what was going on. But there was no smell of alcohol on her breath or in her car.
Were you in this accident?
I don't remember. I don't think so.
You don't think so?
The interesting fact is the driver of the vehicle who's conscious and talking to the officer at the scene when they arrived, lost consciousness before the paramedics arrived, which indicates she had some type of altered level of consciousness or some medical problem going on.
French loses consciousness before she's able to provide any useful information to the investigators. Unable to revive her, emergency personnel on the scene rush her to the hospital. At this point, they are unclear what caused her to collapse. It could be a reaction to drugs or alcohol, or she could have simply fainted as a result of traumatic shock.
The post-traumatic reaction to people at accidents vary from hysteria to very calm acceptance of what happened to not believing what happened. Everybody who's been in an automobile accident has that moment of, I don't know what's going on. Some people that's extended. You also have that situation, people are on different types of medications. The reactions vary, and part of the job that we have is determining when they reacted, how they reacted, and why they reacted that way.
Yeah,
But with Denise French on her way to the hospital, Frank is running out of leads. Fortunately, police soon get a break. 2 witnesses arrive who claim to have seen everything. They report that Denise French was acting strangely well before the crash.
Behind me, they're going back and forth like they were weaving on the highway.
Carl Davis and Marianne Malloy were coming back from a halfway house where they volunteer every week. About 10 minutes after leaving, Carl noticed the headlights of a car that was being driven very strangely and dangerously.
I don't know, she's gonna cause an accident.
According to both witnesses, French passed them and went on to actually bump the Shriver's vehicle. Barbara then lost control of her car and crashed into the back of the truck.
The witnesses that I was able to talk to saw the striking vehicle being driven prior to the collision and described the driving behavior as very erratic. The driver's going at a high rate of speed, weaving from lane to lane in between cars, and at one point even past cars on the shoulder of the roadway to get around them. So they described very erratic behavior that's not normal behavior for a lot of people.
Well, I was on the passenger side, and he kept telling me to look at the lady. You know, she's weaving back and forth. She almost hit us.
One thing's for certain, in this instance, the woman hit the car in front of her. What we did here was a crash test where we had a closing speed, an overtaking speed of only about 12 miles an hour. The speed across the ground is one thing. It's that closing speed that's going to tell us how bad this crash was. And imagine if this was a higher closing speed crash, the rear end of the struck car, the car being overtaken, coming off the ground and going out of control. It can be pretty disastrous.
One vehicle rear-ended another vehicle, caused the driver to lose control, and unfortunately went underneath the rear end of a parked tractor trailer. We know how it happened. But then we have to look in the aspect with what the witnesses are telling us. We need to try and figure out why it happened, why this woman was driving erratically, why she lost control of her vehicle, why she lost consciousness at the scene after having talked to the police for a few moments. That have a profound effect on how we decide to pursue the legal matter and the charges against the person.
Carson's first step in finding an explanation for Denise French's erratic actions is to examine the inside of her car. There are no signs of alcohol bottles or drugs, but something does catch his attention.
One of the first things I noticed when I looked inside of the vehicle, there was a lot of sugary sodas, hard candy, there were pastries in the car, and all over the place, in the glove compartment, in the center console, on the front seat, on the back seat. And there are a lot of people who have a sweet tooth, but they don't normally keep that amount of sugary candy with them.
We all have certain experiences that bring about certain stereotypes. We expect to see the sports car pulled over by police. What doesn't fit that stereotype would be a middle-aged woman driving what would appear to be recklessly down the road. For police on the scene, they're going to draw on their experience, they're going to draw from the physical evidence, and they're going to bring it all together. But if something doesn't add up, there's usually a reason.
As Frank wraps up his on-scene investigation, an officer comes to tell him bad news. Barbara Shriver has just died of her injuries.
Just got confirmation from the dispatcher. The woman in the car accident just died.
Okay.
What Carson still can't figure out is why her car got bumped in the first place.
With the death of Barbara Shriver, all the attention's focused on the other driver, Denise French. It's not clear why a middle-aged woman traveling alone would suddenly start driving erratically. It's also not clear why she seems unaware of the consequences of the crash. Depending on answers to those mysteries, Denise French may be headed for prison.
Barbara Shriver and her daughter Brooke were driving home on an unremarkable evening. They never made it. Shriver's car piled into the back of a tractor trailer after being hit from behind by a driver who was weaving all over the roadway. It's now Frank Carson's job to find out why.
Frank's just learned some unfortunate news. Barbara Shriver died as a result of her injuries. Now his job's going to be to figure out why Denise French's car rear-ended Shriver's. Now, what he determines will help a prosecutor decide if criminal charges should be filed against French. But more than that, it can help provide much-needed closure for the Shriver family.
Frank Carson gets a phone call from the hospital. Denise French, who had passed out shortly after the collision with Shriver's car, is awake again. At the hospital, French reveals that she is a type 1 diabetic.
What happened?
You've been in an auto accident.
No, I'm a diabetic.
Diabetes is a disease in which the body does not produce or properly use insulin, a hormone that is necessary to convert sugars, starches, and other food into energy. As a former emergency medical technician, Frank Carson has seen his share of diabetic episodes.
When your blood sugar level gets very low, most people realize that as hunger, or if you get really hungry, you get the shakes. Well, with a diabetic, the reaction can be a little bit different.
Again, Frank Carson's medical background helps him play out possible scenarios that would explain her actions before the crash and her attitude afterwards. He starts to wonder whether she was having a diabetic crisis.
Normally, if diabetics, the sugar level drops too low in their bloodstream, they don't get that sugar that they need from hard candy or soda, they'll start feeling agitated, they'll start becoming disoriented, perhaps hallucinating, and eventually they'll begin to lose consciousness and pass out, and then it becomes a real health crisis for them, whether they're driving or whether they're at home doing the dishes.
It's possible an insulin imbalance led to this tragedy. But one thing doesn't add up. French's car was full of soda and snacks that would have temporarily brought her levels back up. And not a single bottle or bag had been opened.
For someone that's lived with this disease as long as this lady has, and made the plan she obviously has made carrying this around with her, it doesn't make sense that she wouldn't take advantage of the solution. It was right here in front of her.
So the first thing that you think of is there's some negligence involved. Here's a person who's been a diabetic for 20 years and may not have been managing their condition as well as they could have.
Frank Carson has collected all the clues that the crash scene can offer. With Denise French awake, the next answers will have to come from her. He goes to interview her at the hospital. But what he hears only deepens the mystery. Denise French doesn't believe she had a diabetic crisis.
The driver told me that she had missed her exit where she was going to. She had gotten lost, so she decided to keep going, and she started feeling bad, and she thought that she would get off at the next exit to try and find some place where she could stop and take something to eat, perhaps to get over this feeling, see what was wrong with her, and that's what she remembers.
But Denise French also admits something very important to the outcome of this investigation. She says she doesn't keep a log of her daily diet, her blood sugar level, her insulin intake. The fact that she isn't doing this basic activity may add up to outright negligence in terms of this crash.
Denise French may be looking at a charge of reckless driving causing death. But as Frank Carson assembles the evidence to present to the prosecutor, he uncovers something startling. It might even mean a 180-degree turn in terms of the possible reckless driving charge. As always, Frank Carson asks to see the medical records of the drivers involved in the accident. And that's where he finds an explanation, not only for French's behavior behind the wheel, but why she couldn't feel a diabetic attack coming on in the first place.
She had, within the past several weeks, been diagnosed with high blood pressure or hypertension, and she was prescribed medication to help control that. One's a diuretic, and the other type is called beta blockers. Beta blockers work by regulating the way the heart beats, lowers the heart rate, so your blood pressure lowers. Because what beta blockers do is they will tend to mask or not allow the diabetic to realize that they're having their diabetic crisis. It masks the normal clues that they would have. And that appeared to have been the case with this lady.
Frank Carson's conclusions are simple. The beta blockers masked the normal warning signs of a diabetic crisis and left Denise French helpless to prevent it. Put her behind the wheel in this condition, and it's almost inevitable that something bad would result. In this case, the outcome was tragic. As symptoms of disorientation and fatigue set in, French begins zigzagging all over the road. Speeding up from behind, she rear-ends Barbara Shriver, who crashes into a parked tractor-trailer. Her daughter survives, but Barbara dies as the result of massive internal bleeding. No charges were filed against the driver of the rig or Denise French. As for the doctor who prescribed the beta blocker, the Shriver family ultimately decided not to sue.
Driving requires your full attention. You're operating heavy machinery. In this case, this woman learned a hard lesson about the interaction and the side effects of even over-the-counter drugs. Read the label. That label's going to tell you what's going on, and it can save your life. Planning a crash test is no small undertaking. We usually spend a good bit of the day equipping the cars, and in this case, it's particularly challenging because we're going to be trying for a rollover. Rollovers aren't as easy as folks think. You may have an SUV, you may have wet roads, you may have a lot of conditions that folks think of as relating to rollovers, but they don't always come together to make a rollover occur just as you'd expect. Same thing occurs to investigators in the field. They may be really good investigators, and I may have a really good crash crew, and all of those things should work together. But sometimes, for the investigator in the field, there are convoluted factors that make their investigations pretty difficult.
Carl Webster and his daughter Samantha are trying to find something they can agree on. Together, they're planning a surprise 60th birthday party for Samantha's mother. But just drawing up a guest list is a monumental challenge.
We should invite Judy next door.
And then suddenly, in mid-sentence, their whole world is violently turned upside down. Despite the fact that he was wearing a seatbelt, Carl Webster is killed instantly, his upper body crushed as the truck rolls over and slides off the road. Outside on the grass, his daughter is virtually unscathed, but in a state of shock, having survived one of the strangest accidents investigators here have ever seen. As Samantha is rushed to the hospital, accident investigator Mark Wright arrives on the scene. He and his team of specialists are responsible for putting the pieces of this puzzle together. Why did the pickup flip over? Were any other cars involved? And how could one lucky passenger escape with only minor injuries? Right now, all he has to go on is a mangled truck and a trail of debris.
There are a number of conditions that can bring on a rollover. Driver behavior, reckless driving would be one. A roadway condition or even a mechanical issue might cause one of these very violent events. And when you're ejected in a rollover, you're 4 times more likely to be killed than if you stay inside the car. In this case, the ejected occupant actually survives and the person that stays in the car is killed. And that's just one anomaly here. For the investigators, though, the key is to start with figuring out how this crash happened.
They don't generally just roll over for no reason. There's usually either a violent steering action or hit something that caused them to trip and roll over. When I look at the pickup truck, I'm looking for scuffing on the actual tires themselves and scrapes on the rims to see what may have contacted the road in a violent steering maneuver. I'm looking for damage to the vehicle itself. That'll show me what direction it was sliding and the orientation of the vehicle, and then it helps me to know what to look for on the road as well.
Unfortunately, the inspection of the truck offers Mark Wright no obvious explanation as to why this pickup suddenly began tumbling out of control. His next step is to begin the painstaking examination of a field of debris that stretches back almost 200 feet from the wreck.
Just immediately leading up to where the pickup truck was paint transfer on the asphalt. And that's pretty typical of a vehicle that's on its roof. Before that, I saw some tire marks, and that's typical of a hard steer maneuver. Just before that, there was actually a circular scratch on the road surface. There was actually 2 of them, and they looked like 2 circular wheels.
2 circular impressions imprinted on the asphalt baffle Mark Wright and his team of investigators. Everything else in the debris field clearly came from Carl Webster's truck, but the source of these marks and the role they played in the crash is a complete mystery.
So, Mark, you've got a complex scene here with a lot of physical evidence. Have you sorted this out? Have you ruled anything out yet?
Yes, I looked at the vehicle itself, and I've ruled out that it's been involved in a collision with any other vehicle.
Have you got a working theory so far?
Yes, I do. Actually, we've got a tire scrub and a circular impact mark on the ground, which does not come from the involved pickup truck. So my theory at this point is that it's hit something to cause it to go out of control.
And you haven't found that yet?
No, we have not.
While a team searches for anything that may have left the impressions in the road, Mark Wright sets out to find the speed of the pickup truck at the point of impact. With no evidence to suggest Carl Webster was impaired, knowing his speed will allow investigators to better understand the crash. They'll know how suddenly a hazard would have appeared to Webster and why a minor impact produced such a devastating crash.
Energy is equal to 1/2 mass times velocity squared. It's a very elementary equation that a lot of accident investigators learned in high school and middle school, but probably thought they'd never use again. Turns out, for accident reconstruction, this is a very useful model. We know the energy. We can figure out how much energy is used up skidding the car or doing damage. We know the mass. We know the weights of the car. So there's two of the unknowns. The last value, speed, that's what we're a lot of times solving for. And if we know these two, we can get to that one.
Mark determines that Carl Webster and his daughter Samantha were doing just 50 miles per hour in the seconds before their pickup struck an object in the road, flipped onto its roof, and began rolling across the road. As the on-scene investigation wraps up, Mark Wright is left to wonder about just what Carl Webster hit and whether he saw it in his final seconds or was oblivious to the danger.
So you're driving down the road and you're faced with debris. You have two choices. You can swerve or you can hit it. Swerving can cause its own problems, depending on your speed, the roadway conditions, the type of vehicle you're in. A swerve could put you out of control. On the other hand, hitting it may be the lesser of two evils. So in this case, did our driver actually choose to hit what was in the roadway? We can't really tell for sure until we know what it is he hit.
The next morning, officers search in the fields surrounding the crash site for any object that may have come into contact with the pickup truck. An object heavy enough to initiate a rollover on impact, but small enough to be invisible to a driver at night.
We found this tire about 350 meters off the roadway in a farmer's field. And what we were trying to do is determine, did this tire have anything to do with the actual collision? What we did find was a gash in the tire and other damage to the rim that corresponds to rim damage to the front tire of this pickup truck. And also, we found an area of cleaning on the leaf spring itself. It's actually damaged. So we've been able to determine that this tire was impacted by the front tire of the pickup truck and then contacted the leaf spring on the pickup truck. The tire would have caused a violent rotation. In this case, it rotated counterclockwise within less than a second. The pickup truck was on its roof and sliding.
How this tire wound up in the middle of a high-speed road may never be answered, but it's now clear that it caused the rollover that took Carl Webster's life. Although the front end of the pickup was able to skip over the tire, the rear end could not, and the force of the impact with the back wheels was enough to send the truck tumbling across the road. But this discovery only gives rise to more questions. With one mystery solved, Mark Wright must turn his attention to Samantha Webster's miraculous story of survival.
Collisions with debris in the roadway are a daily occurrence. A lot of times they end up causing pretty dramatic crashes. In this case, we have a truck that hits a spare tire that's left in the roadway, results in a really, really bad rollover. The driver staying in the car is actually killed, and the passenger who was ejected walks away with minor injuries. Usually it's the other way around. This is a pretty amazing case.
The forces experienced by occupants in a rollover are catastrophic. Anyone unrestrained is powerless to keep themselves in the car. Ejected through a window, victims often suffer severe head and neck injuries when they hit the ground, or are killed when the vehicle itself rolls over them. Even if they're belted in like Carl Webster, they can be crushed if the roof caves in on them. But investigators are stumped by Samantha Webster's remarkable story of survival. Her physical injuries suggest she was not in the wreck that killed her father. Police hope she can tell them exactly how and when she escaped the truck.
Recollection of the passenger was that they were just driving along normal. They were just talking, and all of a sudden she finds herself in the ditch.
I just remember the truck kind of like bouncing off to one side a bit, and then it just started rolling.
So she really didn't have a huge recollection of what even happened. They didn't see or hear anything. It was just on the roof and off the road. She doesn't know how she got out of the pickup. She was just out and in the grass.
Samantha Webster's description of the crash reminds investigators that rollovers occur in a fraction of a second and at speeds beyond our level of perception. Coupled with the incredible forces she experienced, it's little wonder Samantha is unable to describe her experience in detail. To understand what she may have gone through will require duplicating a rollover on a closed stretch of highway.
First attempt got both front tires off.
Yeah. I cheated more.
You cheated closer to the fog line.
Cheated more, yeah. Just like someone correcting and bringing it back on the road. We have to get the wheels off the road and then have to bring it back on.
Yep.
So we get the left, the right steer, but it's got to be off the road.
We need that change in friction surfaces on all the tires.
As you can see, this one just slid. Yeah. As long as this one just slid, we're not going to get it.
Yes, we got more dig from the front tires on the first attempt.
Now that's the way it should work.
That was 3 complete turns and it landed on its feet just like a cat. Now look at the big impact on the passenger side on the off side of the roll. That would not be very friendly for the passenger.
No, this is ugly. Rollovers are incredibly violent events. Once where I had 4 or 5 inches of headroom, all of a sudden now on this side I find I have next to none. But still in all, seat belts are going to save your life. They're going to keep you in the car and protect you, keep you from moving to the roof when the roof's on the ground, and that's the best protection, much better than being out on the road.
The damage done to the SUV during the rollover test only reinforces the unlikelihood of Samantha Webster's miraculous escape. But Mark Wright has spent the better part of an afternoon examining the wreck of the pickup, and he now has a theory as to how Samantha was able to beat the odds and survive.
We were able to conclude that coupled between the seat belt, it's attached to the B-pillar, and when the vehicle rolled over, the B-pillar was compromised, and that created some slack in the seat belt, and that, along with the seat braking itself, created more slack. So the seat belt did its job initially in the initial rollover to hold the passenger in place, but on the second impact, when the pickup truck actually left the road and went into the ditch, there was enough slack that the passenger was ejected through the passenger side window. Fortunately for her, the ditch was soft grass, the ground was moist, and it was able to assist her in not sustaining any serious injuries.
Typically, if a person's ejected, they come to an immediate deceleration because they hit another stationary object. That individual then will sustain massive acceleration, deceleration, rotation forces on the brain, leading to eventually brain death. In this scenario, what happened was that there was a slower deceleration because the person was perhaps sliding along the grass, and those types of deceleration forces that one associates with severe brain injury did not occur.
Mark Wright arrived on the scene of a fatal rollover and found more questions than answers. But with the last piece of the puzzle in place, he is finally able to say exactly how this tragedy unfolded. Carl Webster is driving his pickup at about 50 miles an hour. Suddenly, he hits a fully inflated tire lying in the middle of the road. The front end of the pickup immediately bounces, raising the rear wheels. When they touch back down, the left rear spring cuts into the tire, forcing the truck onto its side and into a deadly rollover. Samantha's life is saved in those first milliseconds by her seatbelt, which holds her firmly in place. But the roll is so violent, it smashes the roof and rips her seat from its moorings, providing a momentary slack in the belt. This allows Samantha to be ejected out of the passenger window and onto the soft roadside grass. Had she stayed in the truck, she would have most likely been crushed to death. Although grateful to have survived, Samantha Webster doesn't dwell on how lucky she is. Her own survival is a daily reminder of the night she lost her father.
The other interesting aspect of this crash was that spare tire in the roadway. You have to wonder how many people drove by that without hitting it. Drivers have a responsibility to secure the load in their vehicles. They also have a responsibility to get things out of the roadway that come off their vehicles when it's safe to do so. In either case, we wouldn't have known all of that had it not been for the good work of Mark Wright and the other investigators involved.
Next, a young girl is struck by two drivers while riding her motorized scooter. Both say they couldn't avoid the collision. The physical evidence says otherwise.
I got to the scene. Something really caught my eye was the length of the skid marks.
I'm sure you've seen it before. A kid as young as 9 or 10 on a scooter zooming in and out of the streets and intersections. Makes you ask yourself, when are we old enough to be a responsible driver? Well, you'll get an answer in this next story.
Stacy Wilson can't believe her good luck. Her best friend Heather has just let her borrow a brand new motorized scooter for the first time. The 14-year-old is a bit wobbly on it, but gets going okay. After a quick loop through the neighborhood, she's just a few blocks away from home, but she'll never get there. Stacy's scooter drifts into the wrong lane of traffic with tragic consequences.
The information we had was that it was a young girl was dead at the scene from being hit by at least 2 vehicles. When you find out that a young life is gone, it really affects you. You still got to put your emotions aside and do your investigation, but again, the kids are the worst.
John Heineman leads the vehicular crime unit at the local police department. When he gets to the scene, Stacy Wilson's body is still there. A car and an SUV have pulled over as well, and both drivers have admitted to hitting the young victim. It may seem like a simple case of a little girl losing control of her scooter, but John has his work cut out for him.
Hi, I'm Sergeant John Hyman with the Phoenix PD's Vehicular Crimes Unit.
It's his job to uncover the precise chain of events leading up to the accident and make certain that everyone involved is telling the truth.
We'll get going. Which vehicle were you driving?
I was in the first vehicle.
The sedan?
Yes.
The first driver I started talking to was the driver of the car involved in the collision. It was the first vehicle that the GoPed hit.
And you were driving the SUV?
Yeah, it's right behind her.
Okay. What I'm going to first do is I'm going to interview each separately. I'll start with you.
Stephanie Jackson is the driver of the car. She is traumatized by what happened. After all, she has 2 children herself.
When I started the interview with the first driver, she told me she was going down the street approximately 30 miles per hour, the speed limit. Saw this GoPed. She pulled off to the side, but not in time. The GoPed sideswiped her, causing the GoPed to go to the right, or the GoPed fell to the ground.
Jackson insists that she did all she could to avoid the collision.
And so I veered off and had to swerve off of the road.
Emergency workers on the scene suggest that Stacy head injuries are one of the most common causes of accident fatalities.
Once the head is hit by a moving object, it accelerates very quickly, and then usually will decelerate once it hits the ground very quickly. The abrupt acceleration and deceleration of the soft brain within the hard skull causes massive injury in the nerves and the blood vessels throughout the brain. There's massive swelling in the brain because of the injury to the small nerves and the blood vessels. That swelling or edema within the brain can actually increase the pressure inside of the brain to such an extent that the heart is unable to pump blood flow to the brain adequately. In that case, what will happen is that the brain will eventually die.
To verify Jackson's story, Heineman examines her car. There are clear signs of the impact. A black scratch mark along the side of the vehicle appears to be consistent with the driver's explanation that the scooter and the car came in contact.
There was alcohol, but we didn't drink.
Heineman also has witnesses. Bridget Turnbull and her brother James were walking down the street when they saw Stacy pass by on her motorized scooter. James gives the most detailed testimony.
And as soon as the GoPed rider passed by him, he looked back, knew he was going to hit this car, and saw the collision with the sedan and the GoPed.
The witnesses appear to confirm that it was young Stacy who hit the car, just as the driver said. The next interview is with Kathy Morgan, the driver of the second vehicle involved. Morgan is also in shock. She was following the car in her SUV and saw the car brake and pull over. The next thing she knows, there's a young child lying on the roadway in front of her. Morgan hits the brakes, but could not avoid running over Stacy.
Kathy, as you were behind your friend, how fast were you going?
I was going the speed limit, like 30 or 35.
She said that she was going the speed limit, maybe just a little faster, but no more than 10 miles faster, 30 to 40 miles max.
I mean, I couldn't see anything in front of me. I mean, I tried to stop as fast as I could.
So everyone appears to be singing the same song here. They've all got the same story going. The little girl's riding this motorized toy vehicle down the middle of the road. The two drivers, they tried to avoid her. They just couldn't. Case closed, right? No. Turns out the physical evidence is telling us someone is responsible for the little girl's death.
Some people think that, you know, these automobiles, they're just accidents. And the criminal charges aren't warranted because it's just an accident. Well, they're not accidents, they're collisions or crimes.
In any crash, what the drivers say and what the witnesses claim they saw can help investigators determine what happened. But the strongest stories are always told by the physical evidence. Injuries to bodies, marks on the vehicles. It doesn't lie. And in the investigator's mind, that physical evidence is adding up quite differently than what at least one of the people involved is saying.
Something that really caught my eye was the length of the skid marks. Looked several hundred feet in length. Knowing this was a residential street with a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, 200 feet of skid marks is going to put the speed up around 60 miles an hour of this vehicle, twice the speed limit that was the posted speed.
John measures the skid marks, and as he expected, they confirm his doubts. The driver of the SUV was well over the speed limit before she ran over the child.
Skid marks on the roadway. In police work, we call that a clue. It's a clue that tells us she was on the brakes trying to stop the car. She's probably too inexperienced to realize that skidding, you're just going to go in a straight line. If she'd let her foot off the brake, she probably could have steered, regained control, and avoided the crash.
Looking at the evidence on the road, the skid marks, I knew that driver was reacting to something, and it hit her brakes hard. And had she been going that speed limit, she would have stopped in ample time to avoid the impact with the young girl on the road.
Now, whether that would have saved Stacy's life is a crucial issue here. The little girl did hit her head on the pavement after bouncing off the car. But Heinemann doesn't know yet which impact actually caused the child's death. Depending on the answer to that question, one of these drivers may be looking at some jail time.
The parents of 14-year-old Stacy Wilson are looking for answers after a tragic accident on a nearby residential street. The investigation so far has shown that Stacy's motorized scooter ran into the side of a car, knocking her backward onto the roadway. An SUV following close behind could not stop before running her over. After measuring the skid marks, accident investigator John Heinemann has determined that the SUV was going nearly double the speed limit. A lot of factors can affect how a vehicle behaves when a driver hits the brakes. The condition of the road, the weather, wear and tear on the brakes themselves. All of those factors may play a role here.
Since it was a criminal investigation, took the SUV and did a series of skid tests. 3 of the skid tests at 50 miles per hour, 60 miles per hour, and 40 miles per hour. Took all 3 tests, came up with my values that I needed for the investigation.
Drivers don't realize what a difference 10, 15 miles an hour makes when it comes time to brake. It can be the difference between a good scare and a guilty conscience. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this car and I'm gonna skid at 30 and then 50. See how much difference it really does make.
Obviously, the faster a vehicle is traveling, the harder it is to control in a skid. At this point, it's John Heinemann's opinion that Kathy Morgan, the driver of the SUV, should be charged with vehicular manslaughter.
5 miles per hour. Kathy, I had a chance to look at the investigation. I know the GoPed's on the wrong side of the road, but I have an issue with your speed.
I told you I was going the speed limit.
You're not going 30 or 35. Just your skid alone has you at 60 to 65 miles per
I
hour.
was not. There was nothing I could do. It wasn't my fault.
It's going to be a homicide investigation.
What?
And the case is going to be sent to the county attorney's office.
I didn't do anything. I didn't mean to hit that girl.
Young girl died. And had they been going 30 miles an hour, the speed limit, nothing would have happened. They would never even impacted that victim. So we got an obligation to the victim to set forth the criminal proceedings and put the criminal justice system in motion. You know, maybe harsh, but there's consequences with everything.
The next step is to determine exactly how the victim was killed.
To get a conviction, John's going to have to show that it wasn't the first impact and fall to the ground that killed the little girl, but rather the second impact with the SUV. To do that, he's going to go to a biomechanical expert for a head drop test.
Biomechanical experts examine how both internal and external forces impact the human body. The head drop test will help determine if the force of Stacy's fall after the first collision with the car caused her fatal skull fracture.
John, what we have here is a drop tower. This will allow us then to look at the question, in this case, of whether or not falling over could have produced the head injury that we see in the victim. And this is what it looks like. What we saw in the head drop experiment, John, was the force that results strictly from a fall. And we demonstrated on the basis of magnitude that that would be insufficient to produce any kind of major head injury, certainly not a fatal one.
Remember that Stacy was wearing a helmet, which significantly reduces the impact and the injuries caused by the fall alone. And that is only one of the elements that leads Kerry Knapp to his conclusions that Stacy could not have died as a result of her fall. Her head injuries reveal another story.
What you get in a broad-based strike like that is, if you get anything, you get a very large, round depression. And in this particular case, what we had is a very, very severe skull fracture in this area with multiple depressed fragments. That requires not only a lot of energy, but a very focal strike. There's only one source of high velocity, high energy focal strike, and that would be strike by the following SUV. Right.
But for the county medical examiner, things are not so clear. In the autopsy report, he disagrees and writes that the fall alone after the collision with the car could have caused Stacy's death. It will be the county prosecutor's job to decide if, even with conflicting medical opinions, he will charge Kathy Morgan for reckless driving. As for John Heineman, his investigation is finished, and he can now replay the tragic chain of events that led to Stacy Wilson's fatal accident. The 14-year-old was enjoying her first ride on a motor scooter when something went terribly wrong. For some reason, she ends up crossing the center line and running into the oncoming car of Stephanie Jackson. She is knocked off her scooter, and her head hits the ground hard. Coming from behind at 60 miles per hour, Kathy Morgan hits the brakes, but is unable to stop before running over her body. Stacy dies of a severe skull fracture. But in the end, the county prosecutor decided not to charge Kathy Morgan for vehicular homicide. While she was clearly speeding, the inconsistency between the biomechanic and autopsy reports left doubt as to which collision actually caused Stacy's fatal injury.
However, the city had enough information to develop a ban on toy vehicles in the roadway, and a lot of other cities and states have followed suit. As for our two drivers, well, hopefully they're going to follow the rules of the road, and this will change the way they drive. Remember, speed kills.
Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
I'm going to bet he's going to land about here. That's my bet.
Here, I'll put your stack of quarters here.
Crashes are like puzzles, and when you got a crash scene, you've got all the pieces of the puzzle, but you don't know how they go together. It's the accident reconstructionist, the accident analyst's job to put those pieces together. And sometimes you're missing pieces, like, for example, one of the cars involved, as in a hit and run.
It's a beautiful Friday afternoon in a little town. Charlie Newsom is riding along a quiet local road on his way to a nearby restaurant. He's been working there for nearly a year now, and Charlie's never missed a day on the job. Today will be an exception. It's 4 p.m. when accident investigator Weston Brown is called to the scene of a serious hit and run. By the time he arrives, the victim has already been transported to a trauma center. The responding officer informs him that Charlie was unconscious and appeared to be critically injured.
This case seemed, at the time, to be so very disturbing, and as I went on, it became even much more disturbing.
As Detective Brown soon discovers, Charlie Newsom is no stranger to tragedy. At the age of 3, he was in a devastating car accident that killed both his parents and left him with neurological damage and slight autistic tendencies. Adopted and raised by his aunt after the accident, Charlie courageously fought his way through high school and finally received his diploma at age 20. He got his first job the following year, when he was hired as an assistant cook in a restaurant just outside of town.
Charlie had thought of getting a license, but had chosen not to get a driver's license because he didn't feel that he had the faculties to safely operate a motor vehicle, and he didn't want to hurt anyone. And so rather than get a license and drive, which would be the easiest thing to do, he had to ride his bike something like 8 miles each way to work. He chose to do it the hard way.
In a hit-and-run situation, the crash scene is also a crime scene. As a first step, Wes starts collecting as much roadway evidence as possible, but the site isn't offering much information. Then, on the edge of the road, Wes discovers some kind of crack in the asphalt. In one precise spot, it appears to Wes that the crack has been cleaned out, possibly by the bike tire, which would fit inside the crack almost perfectly.
I think what happens is that car strikes the back of that bicycle and it locks up that rear tire. It wipes this crack clean. It just takes the dirt and debris out of this crack.
Wes establishes the point of impact to be right there. This tells him that Charlie did not swerve into traffic. The car must have come off the travel portion of the road prior to hitting him.
Always be thinking of what possibilities there are. One of those could be the driver's fallen asleep. Another one could be that the driver's distracted, not paying attention to what's going on, changing the radio, dialing a cell phone. Could this have been an intentional act?
The reason the car left the roadway could have serious ramifications for the driver. But the fact that the person fled the scene automatically makes it a crime, and Wes's immediate priority is to find any clue that will lead him to this individual.
The longer that we go without finding the suspect, the less likely we are to find the suspect or the suspect vehicle.
Okay, for a police accident investigator at the scene of a crash where there's a hit and run, the idea is to get the word out as to what kind of car is missing. So he's going to have to work from evidence at the scene to figure out what kind of car it is, what it might look like, where the damage is. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to see exactly what kind of damage, what kind of evidence on the roadway we can find. That was some crash. All right, assuming we found this car after the hit and run, they tracked him down. The idea is tie this car to this bicycle hit. What we'd be looking for is stuff on the front bumper, some indications here of the tire having been struck. We'll even see print from the tire mark. This is gonna help them identify that this car hit a bicycle. We'd be looking through the hood area and then up into the windshield for some indication of a body, in particular, the body that was hit in this crash. In here's where his head struck. We're gonna find hair, if it's a real person as opposed to the dummy. We may find skin, clothing imprints through here, and bits and pieces off his clothes. We'd look for little teeny threads, and that's gonna tie this guy to this hit and run.
Tiny pieces of glass found on the scene tend to confirm what Wes was already expecting. Just like in the typical car cyclist collision, Charlie's body was thrown up onto the windshield. For the windshield to break, the car needed to be rolling at a minimum speed. But Wes also notes that Charlie and his bike were not found too far from the point of impact. Based on the position of the body and the bike, Wes is then able to estimate the speed of the vehicle.
I did establish the speed range somewhere between 28 and 38 miles an hour.
Having a good idea of the vehicle's speed at the time of impact, Wes is able to theorize on the severity of the car's damage. He puts the word out to dispatch that he's looking for a passenger car with only limited damage to the extreme right front and a smashed windshield. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Charlie's aunt is receiving devastating news. The doctor explains that Charlie's 4th and 6th vertebrae have been crushed, and his spinal cord has been irreparably damaged. The injuries are consistent with Wes Brown's theory of how the crash happened. Charlie's body was thrown onto the car, and his head violently smashed the windshield. His helmet apparently protected him from major head injury, but his neck took the shock. His vertebrae broke on impact, and the resulting damage to the spinal cord cut off most of his nerves from his brain. At age 22, Charlie Newsome will live the rest of his life as a quadriplegic.
Car accidents are a common cause of quadriplegia, and it's oftentimes the most frequent cause that we see in our hospital. Typically, there are injuries to the spinal cord between the 5th and 7th cervical vertebrae, where the spinal cord is either cut or damaged to the point where the nerve signals that are coming from your brain can't go out to your arms and your legs.
After hearing of Charlie's devastating injuries, Detective Brown is more determined than ever to bring this hit-and-run driver to justice.
I learned about Charlie and his disability and the things that he'd been through early on in his life. And I say that because Charlie worked his whole life to be his own man, to be on his own. He just bought his first house on his own with no help from anyone else. And the very thing that he'd worked for all his life, he will never, ever have again. From eating to something as personal as going to the bathroom, Charlie will have to be helped and waited on the rest of his life, which was the very thing that Charlie didn't want.
The victim of a hit and run will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Now, police are counting on investigator Weston Brown's damage profile of the striking vehicle in order to track down a runaway driver. The following morning, Sergeant Dave Morris is on a routine patrol when he notices a red import sedan traveling about 8 kilometers away from the crash site. He only catches a glimpse of the car, but thinks that he observes some damage to the front of the vehicle. He quickly turns around and runs the license plate number through dispatch. As soon as he learns that the car has an expired registration, he pulls the driver over. The driver is identified as Eric McMahon. He tells the police that he's on his way to an auto glass shop to repair his windshield. But when asked about the cause of the damage, McMahon offers an unlikely story. He insists that the car was attacked by a gang of children throwing eggs and rocks. Sergeant Morris takes a closer look at the windshield and notices a few strands of hair in the upper portion.
Sergeant Morrison contacted me and said, I may have a vehicle here. It matches the description that you gave me. The damage is the same, and there's some hair in the windshield. Can you come out and take a look at it?
Eric McMahon is arrested for an expired registration and driving with a suspended license. Wes also obtains a search warrant for the vehicle, and the car is impounded for further investigation. When Wes enters the garage to inspect McMahon's car, he immediately knows he's on the right track. The front bumper is seriously damaged, and Wes discovers marks consistent with a bike tire on the underpinning of the vehicle. The hair from the windshield also matches Charlie's hair color and length. Wes collects the hair samples for DNA testing.
I'm feeling good that I have the right car. This is the car that's involved in the collision. Now I have to do some interviews and in order to put the driver behind the wheel. The question really is, who was driving that vehicle?
Wes interrogates McMahon, who claims that he has no idea what the police are talking about. He has no knowledge of Charlie's accident at all, and goes so far as to say that he was at home all day the day before. Questioned about the hair, he adds a new line to his story, saying that he now thinks he might have also hit a small deer with his car just the week before.
So I'm feeling very confident that this guy's starting to get caught up in his lies.
Looking for more evidence, Wes obtains a search warrant for McMahon's house.
Good evening. Are you Eric McMahon's mom?
Yes, I am.
The suspect is a university student living with his parents. His mother and little sister are obviously distraught when Wes tells them that Eric has been arrested.
I really kind of felt bad for the family, but, you know, a very nice, upper middle class, upstanding mom and dad, still married, good people. They came across at least as very nice people. And here's the police serving a search warrant on their house in this neighborhood.
Wes starts searching McMahon's room for evidence.
One of the things I was looking for was anything that would lead me to the area that Eric was the day before.
And that's exactly what Wes finds. A credit card receipt from a bar situated just a block away from the collision site.
At first, when I looked at it, I just looked and went, oh, the corner bar, 1 beer, not that big a deal. And then I looked at the date and I said, hey, that was the day of the collision. And then I looked at the time and I went, oh my gosh, that is the time the collision occurred. That is just before the collision occurred. This is really important. And I was very happy to find that piece because now it leads me down another trail. Now I can go to that bar and contact the people at that bar and talk to them about, hey, do you remember this person? Things like that. Okay, was he in here
The bartender tells Wes that Eric McMahon is a regular. On the afternoon of the crash, she distinctly remembers him playing some pool by himself, having only 1 beer, and heading out alone.
And I had to think to myself, well, geez, here's a guy who's even only had 1 beer. Why is he just hitting this person, leaving his broken body on the side of the road for this man to die?
Weston can now prove that Eric McMahon was in the area of the crash scene at the exact time of the collision. He can also prove that the damage to McMahon's car matches the victim's injuries and the evidence at the scene. And when the DNA test finally reveals that the hair found on the suspect's windshield belongs to Charlie Newsome, Wes is confident that he can recount the events that led to this devastating hit and run.
The facts are the facts.
On a Friday afternoon, Charlie Newsome is riding his bike to work along the cycling lane of a local road. At the same time, Eric McMahon is on his way home after playing pool in a nearby bar.
We're never able to determine why the car left the road. For whatever reason, maybe he was distracted.
For a reason that remains a mystery, McMahon's vehicle leaves the roadway and strikes Charlie Newsome. Thrown onto the hood, Charlie smashes his head on the windshield. The impact breaks Charlie's neck and hurls him up onto an adjacent lawn. Fully aware of what has happened, Eric McMahon contemplates his next move. To stay and help his victim means to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead, he chooses to flee, leaving Charlie's broken body on the roadside.
Probably one of the most touching moments of this entire case for me was the sentencing. Charlie's aunt was there, and she had a prepared letter that she read to the entire courtroom at sentencing. And one of the sentences in there, and I have the letter here with me, one of the sentences in there was, I did, however, read the entire file to Charlie. We haven't got a whole lot else to do these days. And I asked him if there was anything he would like me to say to the court. And Charlie said no. And this, I believe, was because he had already made excuses for Mr. McMahon's behavior and dismissed them from memory. That is what Charlie does to people who injure him. Still, the court may find it interesting, as I did, that as I was putting the file away, Charlie looked up and said, and Your Honor, this is verbatim, "Boy, I'm sure glad I'm not that guy." As he's laying in his bed, without the use of his hands, without the use of his arms, without the use of his legs, he says, "Boy, I'm sure glad I'm not that guy." I find that pretty moving.
Charlie Newsome never moved to his new house. He still lives with his aunt. Eric McMahon is presently serving a 7-year prison sentence.
Driving along and suddenly you find a police car parked in your lane across the road. Lights are on. Of course you slow down, but what else are you supposed to do? Emergency vehicles, particularly police cars, don't stop like that for no reason. They're blocking the lane, something's going on. At the very least, you should stop and see if someone comes out to give you directions. When you do go through, you start out at a real low speed and stay that way till you know it's clear, because you never know what's going to be just around the curve.
After a 9-hour flight, Elliot Dobson is on his way home to his family. Fresh out of med school, he spent the last 15 months in Africa as a volunteer medic. Traveling swiftly on a road he knows well, he's just minutes away from a clean bed, familiar faces, and his mom's home cooking. Then, as he winds around a long curve, a woman appears in the middle of the roadway waving her arms wildly. He sees her just in time to react to the overturned van straddling the lanes in front of him. The woman is hysterical. She explains that she's been in a crash. She's not hurt, but the occupant of the other car has been ejected in the collision. Elliot takes one look at the driver and knows that he's been seriously injured. The man has a wide-open gash on his forehead that is pumping out a lot of blood, and he's complaining of pains in his chest.
Please, there's been an accident over there.
He covers the victim with a blanket to control the man's temperature, applies pressure to his wounds, and reassures him that help is on the way. Matthew Glass is the first police officer to get on the site.
We had to make the scene safe first.
Because the crash occurred just beyond a curve in the road, drivers don't have a lot of time to react to the scene. Officer Glass immediately backs up his cruiser and parks at an angle with the lights flashing to alert approaching traffic.
You want to build a shell around your scene to protect yourselves so you can get in there without worrying about who's coming behind you or who's coming this way, so you can work and do what you've got to do to take care of these people.
Matthew is relieved when he learns that a doctor is already on site. This allows him to relay medical information about the victim to EMS that are already on their way. But Elliot is worried. He knows that traffic crashes are the cause of 55% of paralysis. A few minutes later, veteran accident investigator Mike Barnes is on his way home from work when he notices that the road is blocked ahead of him. By this time, a backup police unit has arrived and an officer is redirecting traffic.
I asked him what was going on. He said he had an accident down the road, and so I decided to go up and see if I could provide some help.
At the scene, Mike immediately recognizes his fellow officer, Matthew Glass. His first question is about the condition of the victims.
He was attending the driver of the van, and Dr. Dobson was attending to him as well. They had stopped the bleeding on his head, and I asked Matt if there was anything else I could do for him.
Matthew asks Mike if he could look after the woman who was also involved in the crash. Betty Reynolds is not injured, but she's still in tears. Her damaged white sedan is parked on the shoulder further down the road. She explains to Mike that she was driving alongside the other car when she dropped her cell phone. She reached down to get it, but before she knew it, a van was skidding out of control in front of her. At some point, the vehicle started to flip over and the driver was thrown out. Once Reynolds regained control of her car, she pulled over and immediately ran to get help.
Anytime you get behind the wheel, there's an alarming number of other drivers around you using their cell phone to send a text message or talk while they're driving. Studies suggest you're 4 times more likely to be involved in an injury crash if you're using your phone and driving. Many states have actually outlawed the use of cell phones, and it's being debated at other states and at the federal level. Should it be outlawed altogether? Still a controversial issue.
As emergency personnel arrive at the scene, an officer approaches to take Betty Reynolds' official statement. Sensing that everything is under control, Mike heads out.
I headed on home. The scene was secured. EMS was on the way, and they did not need me.
But Mike's day is far from over. Just minutes after he leaves the scene, he gets an urgent call from the Traffic Bureau supervisor.
My cell phone rang, and the lieutenant called me and told me about there was an accident at this scene, and I told him that I had just left there. And then he told me he had 2 people dead. Officer Glass was injured. And so then I realized that he was talking about an accident that happened after I had left.
Mike is now asked to handle this case personally. He turns around and rushes back to the site, expecting the worst.
When the lieutenant told me that officers were involved, that heightened my awareness, I think, a little bit more. I have to be honest about that. When we need help, who's going to help us but another cop?
After being thrown from his vehicle in a severe car accident, a man now identified as Bill Witherspoon rests in the middle of the roadway. As EMS personnel arrive on the scene, Officer Matthew Glass and Dr. Elliot Dobson are tending to the victim's injuries. Drivers approaching the curb see police car lights flashing and stop. All except for one.
I began to hear people screaming. Can't see anything because at that time I'm looking at the roof of the minivan. And then I just remember hearing the rev of an engine.
Only minutes before, accident investigator Mike Barnes had left a crash scene that had been completely secured and where everything was under control. He quickly realizes why his boss asked him to return.
Oh, it looked like a bomb had went off compared to what I had seen before.
As Mike gets closer to the vehicles, he realizes that the minivan is back on its wheels. The roof is completely destroyed, and pinned beneath the vehicle is the body of Bill Witherspoon.
That van had rolled and then ended up landing on him, and he died because of that. That impact was real severe.
Debris is now scattered over a 90-meter radius. So Mike knows that whatever hit that van kept running on its own momentum.
I could not find the doctor and could not find Officer Glass. So I continued to walk, and when I went around the van, that's when I spotted Officer Glass over in the side of the road, severely injured.
Matthew Glass has also suffered a tremendous blow to his head, and his leg is crushed and mangled.
I just remember seeing shadows, people running, screaming. None of it was with clarity, though. No, it's like I couldn't see details, but I could see people, bodies.
Several meters down the road, in the center of the roadway, Mike notices another body already covered with a blanket. Dr. Elliot Dobson's trip home has come to a tragic end just a few kilometers from his destination. Having just arrived on the scene in response to the first accident, EMS personnel can no longer help Bill Witherspoon or Elliot Dobson. The priority is now to save the life of Officer Matthew Glass.
I know him, I've known him for some time. So I immediately went to him, and so I helped them load him up into the ambulance. I talked to him, assured him that he's being taken care of, and everything was going to be okay.
Although Mike is a professional who knows he has a job to do, he can't help but be concerned about the well-being of his fellow officer.
Well, it's no doubt police officers are brothers. Typically I would show up, it's a job, but now it's someone that I know, and so it gets a little closer to home, and so it's something that you have to swallow a little bit more, but keep your focus on what the job is, and that is to investigate this accident.
Betty Reynolds tells Mike that as she'd been giving her statement to one of the police officers, a black truck came flying into the curb at an incredible rate of speed. It steered left around the police cruiser and then back onto the roadway, speeding up even more as it entered the crash scene. Neither Betty nor the officer saw what happened next, but both agree the impact was like an explosion. The truck ultimately ended its run slamming into Betty's car on the shoulder of the road. Its driver is identified as Jamie Knight.
When I first approached Jamie, he was already talking to an EMS attendant. He was obviously intoxicated. He smelled of alcohol. His eyes were bloodshot. He had some blood on his face, so he was obviously injured though. But he was very combative, uncooperative. So I asked the officer to secure him and to stay with him as the EMS personnel took him to the hospital. My intentions were for the officer to stay with him so we can get a search warrant for his blood and his urine to find out how much alcohol or drugs he may have had in his system.
As the ambulance transports Knight to the hospital, Mike now sets about documenting and exploring his crash scene. As Mike begins his reconstruction of the second crash, he is struck by one thing. There is no trace at all of Jamie Knight trying to avoid the flipped van.
You know, one would expect to see skid marks. They weren't there.
Witness statements support Mike's findings. Nobody can recall seeing the brake lights on Jamie Knight's truck. Instead, they have him going way above the 90km/h speed limit. Considering the momentum needed to send the van flipping back up onto its wheels, Mike makes his own calculations.
We're talking about speeds up to 70 to 90 miles an hour.
As Mike considers the evidence, Knight's blood test results come back from the lab indicating that Knight's alcohol concentration was more than 3 times the legal limit. After 12 hours of on-scene investigation, Mike is finally ready to reconstruct the events leading to this catastrophic collision. After being ejected from his flipped van, Bill Witherspoon lies sprawled in the middle of the roadway. As EMS personnel arrive on the scene, the victim is already being looked after by Officer Glass and Dr. Dobson. Drivers approaching the curve notice the emergency vehicles ahead and stop, but not Jamie Knight.
Jamie Knight was traveling at a high rate of speed. He went around the police car, and the front end of his car hit the bottom of the van, causing it to rotate violently, spin, and land on top of Bill Witherspoon. And Matthew Glass tells us that he felt a hand shove his back. It had to be Dr. Dobson saving his life.
In a heroic effort, Elliot Dobson tries to push Matthew Glass to safety, but the full force of Jamie Knight's truck barrels into them.
It caught part of me hitting my leg, and unfortunately caught all of the hood. The hood caught all of him.
He gets hit full force with the front bumper of Jamie Knight's vehicle and gets projected down the roadway. Knight's vehicle continues to travel down the road and crashes into the next object that's in his lane, which is Betty Reynolds' vehicle.
Officer Matthew Glass underwent 5 surgeries to save his leg, including bone grafting and metal rod implants. Matthew has now fully recovered from his injuries, but his life will never be the same.
You know, you feel guilty for celebrating your life, for celebrating surviving when the guy standing beside you died. The man at my feet died and the man beside me died, and I survived, so it wasn't my time, I guess.
At the trial, the medical examiner report reveals that Elliot Dobson suffered a serious head injury and died instantly when Knight's vehicle struck him. The report also suggests that Bill Witherspoon would have survived his injuries from the first accident had he not been crushed to death by his own van as a result of the second crash. With a staggering wealth of incriminating evidence against him, a jury finds Jamie Knight guilty on 2 counts of murder, assault in the first degree, and DUI. He is sentenced to 20 years in prison.
You know, as an accident reconstructionist, we can tell you how the accident happened, but to tell you why someone did something is out of our realm. We cannot get into their head. We can only speculate. And as a police officer, I would speculate that Jamie Knight did not want to get caught by the police because he was intoxicated, so he was going to run. But unfortunately, when he came around the police car, there was the van. He had already made up his mind. He was not going to stop.
Bravo! Well, they're fresh, but they're going to go away. Every crash has a story to tell. You heard that in the outset of the show, right? Well, those pages of that story are written out here on the asphalt. Tire marks are like the fingerprints of a given car. But sometimes marks on the roadway can cause more questions than give us answers.
Best part is walk around, all the kids are running around.
Ranchers John and Kevin Drake have driven to the regional stock show more times than they can remember. But this year will be different. For the first time in their lives, the two brothers will be attending the event without their father, who died of cancer the previous winter.
Remember the time when Dad fell off the horse?
Exchanging fond childhood memories, they tow their stock trailer on what they think will remain a pretty quiet road until they reach their destination. At the same time, Hank Spinner is returning home from work, telling himself the exact same thing. They couldn't be more wrong. When accident investigator Rod Sadler arrives at the crash scene, he learns that he's got one dead and one seriously injured.
I've learned over the years to separate myself from the personal aspect, not because I'm a person that doesn't care, it's because I have a specific job that I have to do.
On the side of the road, a police officer is looking after Kevin Drake, who has suffered what seems to be a serious head injury during the crash. This is not surprising to Rod, considering the severity of the damage on the Drake's vehicle. But what is surprising is the condition of the unhitched stock trailer. It's only slightly damaged, and the two cows still in there appear to be unharmed. Hank Spinner's truck is parked on the other side of the road and has extensive damage to the cab. Although he is severely injured, Kevin Drake is still conscious as officers await the arrival of the paramedics. He keeps asking for his brother. John Drake was not so lucky. Having been seated on the collision side of the vehicle, his body was crushed by the impact of the crash, and he died almost immediately from massive internal injuries.
Well, when I arrive at a scene like that, it's obvious because a death is involved, it's going to affect somebody's family very deeply. And the important thing to me is to help the family through this process because they want to know what happened, why it happened, and how it happened.
By the time the ambulance arrives, Kevin Drake's head has become dangerously swollen. The severity of his head trauma and his state of consciousness indicate that Kevin could have suffered internal cranial bleeding, and the risk of irreversible damage to the brain is very real. If it's the case, time is against him. As the emergency medical technicians lift him inside the ambulance, Kevin manages to tell Rod that he was driving the pickup truck, but has absolutely no recollection of what has just happened. The driver of the other pickup truck is in shock. Hank Spinner only suffered minor injuries, but when Rod asks him about the accident, Spinner does not remember much either. He says he hadn't even realized there was another vehicle coming towards the intersection until he felt a tremendous crash. His own vehicle came to a skidding stop, and only then did he even become aware of the other pickup truck. Rod assesses the scene. He has two paved country roads connecting together in a T intersection with a stop sign in the direction the Drakes were traveling.
Well, it's pretty obvious that he didn't brake until he reached the stop sign, which is far too late to be able to stop. He slides into the intersection. See those offset skids there? That's where impact was. The Drakes had to stop, and it was very clear that they were not able to in time. Was it human error? Is there a mechanical problem?
So do you think a little weight behind a car might make a difference in terms of stopping distance? We're gonna find out. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take this cone, we're gonna put it out here on the road. I'm gonna drive the trailer toward the cone at a certain speed. Trailer's gonna be empty. I'm gonna get on the brakes and see how long it takes to stop. Then I'll come back through after we load the trailer. I'll drive the same speed and try to brake from the same point. See if it doesn't take a lot longer to stop, more distant. Let's try that experiment. So that works out to be about 20% longer in this case. Now, here's the deal. If you don't allow for enough space in front of you, when you're towing a heavy load, you could be 20% further into the car ahead of you.
Then, an odd-looking set of skid marks suddenly catch Rod's eye. Just behind the pickup truck set of skids are what reconstructionists call skip skids.
See these skids here? They're almost like a dotted line.
Such intermittent marks are usually made by a trailer bouncing along the road with its brakes locked. It can be the result of bumps, potholes, or other irregularities in the roadway surface.
I don't think that in this particular instance, the trailer bouncing was a factor. And the reason that I came to that conclusion is the beef on board was extremely heavy. So I knew there was I hate to use the word mystery, but there was an element here that really needed to be looked into, because I think that there were more things going on than just maybe a trailer not able to brake completely.
A tragic crash has caused the death of a young rancher and left his brother battling for his life. Accident investigator Rod Sadler is struggling to determine exactly why the pickup truck failed to stop at the intersection. And he's mystified by an uncommon type of skid mark originating about 27 meters behind the point of impact. But the morning after the crash, Rod is faced with what is by far the worst part of his job, interviewing John and Kevin Drake's mother.
In this particular case, it was really difficult because Mrs. Drake had already lost one son. Her other son was suffering critical injuries, possibly fatal injuries. She had so many things going through her mind.
But despite her grief, Mrs. Drake desperately wants an explanation for the crash.
She was willing to speak with me. She answered what questions that she could.
She informs Rod that her sons were on their way to the stock show. They'd set off about 2 p.m. for a 4-hour ride. It was a regular trip for them, so it was a route they both knew well, and they were both accustomed to driving with cattle trailers. This information would seem to cast doubt on the possibility that the brothers may have missed the stop sign or gotten confused at the intersection. The mechanical examination of the pickup truck also shows that the brakes were in perfect condition. This rules out the brake failure scenario. But it's noted that the trailer's electric connector to the truck is old and full of rust. The wires are so frayed that the trailer mechanic suspects that electric signals from the truck would possibly not even be transmitted to the trailer. This would mean that the turn signals, the brake signal, and even the electric brakes on the trailer may not have been triggered when the corresponding devices were activated on the pickup truck.
What caught my eye was there was 2 new wires running along the trailer that looked out of place. They really caught my eye. They looked like they didn't belong there.
Following the suspect wires, Rod notices that they had been connected directly to the trailer's electric brakes.
And if they receive power from another
Based on this observation, Rod develops an amazing theory. In an attempt to bypass the rusted-out trailer plug, could the Drakes have simply failed to properly wire the brakes?
and plug it into an identical plug.
Rod recreates the scenario he has in mind. He connects the trailer's brakes to the pin receiving power from the right turn signal, instead of the one corresponding to the pickup truck's brakes.
Would you spin that wheel for me?
Might such a mistake have caused the trailer's brakes to lock and drag just before reaching the intersection, pulling Kevin's attention away from the stop sign?
Let's see what happens when I turn on the right turn signal. So when I turned on the right turn signal, the brakes locked intermittently. I knew from Mrs. Drake that her sons had to turn to the right to go to the stock show. I figured that this was a very important piece of information in our investigation.
After his accident, Kevin Drake spends 4 days at the hospital under intensive observation. But 48 hours after the crash, he has recovered enough to be interviewed by Rod.
Hi, Mrs. Drake. Hi, Kevin. Kevin wasn't able to recall much about the crash, but what he could recall was that the day before the crash, they had had some problems with the wiring on the trailer, and that they hardwired the trailer brakes directly into the truck's plug. This really reinforced my theory about the brakes being wired wrong.
This testimony is the final piece of the puzzle, and after nearly a month-long investigation, Rod is able to replay the chain of events that led to Kevin and John's tragic accident. On a Sunday afternoon, Kevin and John Drake set off for their regular 4-hour drive to the stock show. On a road he knows well, about 30 meters before a crossing, Kevin indicates his intention to turn right. But because of a badly wired attachment between the truck and the trailer, every time the right turn signal on the truck flashes, the trailer brakes activate on and off, leaving intermittent marks on the asphalt.
Suddenly there's something dragging on his pickup truck intermittently, and he's focusing on that rather than what's ahead of him. Because of that, he loses his focus, he refocuses, and suddenly he realizes that he's too close to the stop sign. He locks up his brakes. By that time, it's too late.
Kevin Drake completely recovered from his head injury. But like many people involved in a crash, he might never recover a clear memory of the events leading to the accident that cost his brother's life. In this case, no charges were ever brought against Kevin Drake.
Sometimes it's just a little detail that makes the difference between being involved in a fatal crash and getting on with the rest of your life. You drop your phone on the floor, you leave it there. You got a problem with your wiring, you get a professional to fix it. There aren't accidents, they're collisions. Little common sense goes a long way in keeping us all safe on the road.
Someone here?
Police find the body of a man lying in a ditch 60 feet from the wreckage of his car. Can a few pieces of plastic tell investigators what happened?
I've got to fail to remain here, and I need to investigate this further.
Then in Maryland, the driver of a pickup truck turns a holiday celebration into tragedy for a grieving family. Surviving the wreck, he seems to simply vanish into thin air.
Still has the potential to kill again.
And in New Jersey, a young girl is killed crossing the street. Can her remains tell investigators who dealt the fatal blow? Every year, violent collisions kill 40,000 Americans and injure another 3 million. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
Accident investigation is one of the more challenging assignments in police work. There's not a lot of folks that'll stay with it for very long, and there's a good reason for that. These dedicated professionals can be in the middle of a family celebration, a holiday gathering, a birthday party, and the next thing you know, they're called out to handle a really messy situation on the highway. While the rest of us can stay with friends and family, these are the folks that have to go out there and pick up the pieces of a tragedy.
On the drive home, Michael Richards and his wife Sandy are still reveling in the glow of a lavish company party thrown to celebrate the holidays and ring in the new year. Leaving the party late, they've left themselves only a few hours to prepare for the arrival of their daughter and 2 grandchildren early the next morning. But as they wind around a bend in the road, their attention shifts to a pair of headlights that blind their view. There is no time to react, and in a heartbeat, it's over. Rescue workers arriving just minutes later work frantically to free the couple from their car, knowing their lives hang in the balance. Barely clinging to life, Sandy and Michael are rushed to a nearby hospital. Rescuers then turn the scene over to Gary Lewis, an experienced investigator with one of Maryland's top collision reconstruction units. His job is to find out exactly what would cause such a devastating wreck on a road with a posted speed limit of just 30 miles per hour.
When I arrived at the scene of this wreck, I found a pickup truck that was partially off the roadway. The front end was off into the woods. The back of the truck was still sitting in the westbound lane of the roadway. It was evident that the front bumper of the truck had what we call overridden the front bumper of the car. In other words, it wasn't a bumper-to-bumper hit, but the bumper of the truck went over top of the bumper of the car. Therefore, a lot more damage was caused on the car. Both occupants had been transported from the scene. and the driver of the truck was nowhere to be found.
An empty car at a crash scene fills investigators with dread. Virtually any impact a victim experiences when thrown from the vehicle can produce a fatal head or spinal injury.
The way the wreck happened, theoretically, somebody could have been ejected from that vehicle. So members of fire rescue personnel that arrived on the scene and police department personnel checked the surrounding area for several yards back into the woods to see if anybody had been ejected, and they came up with nothing.
Gary Lewis can only assume that the driver of the pickup was able to walk away from the scene, but he is certain that the driver is injured, most likely suffering from shock.
So when someone goes into a state of shock, their vital organs are starved of oxygen. They can be confused, disoriented, they can wander off. And in a worst-case scenario, should they collapse, if aid isn't brought to them soon enough, they can die because they fail to get enough blood supply to all the internal organs of their body.
Working crashes almost always means working under the worst conditions. Nighttime, damp, wet, snow, rain, you name it, these guys are out doing it at night. Tonight it's a little cold, it's a little bit wet, there's crashes spread out all over the road and into the forest. We're out here in the middle of nowhere and we got a missing driver. This guy could have walked off to get help, could have walked off disoriented, and some injuries set in later, and he may not make it out of the forest.
Trying to recreate a crash from bits of debris and wreckage is always a monumental challenge. Despite that fact, Lewis needs to use what evidence remains to find out exactly what happened. Given the extent of their injuries, Lewis knows he may never get the chance to ask the Richards what they saw.
The wreck's already happened when we get there, so we have to deal with from crash to final rest. So we have the post-crash energy, and we need to use that into some type of formula that's going to tell us what came into that wreck. The car had been traveling westbound, was hit and redirected back eastbound. And then knowing the weights, you can calculate what kind of energy it would take to redirect that car back in the other direction a certain distance. Based on that, I obtained an impact speed of the truck at a minimum of 46 miles an hour.
Using detailed measurements and a survey of the damage, Lewis determines that the pickup truck was well over the speed limit of 30 miles per hour at impact. But evidence ripped into the asphalt has more to tell about the pickup's role in the crash.
Well, Gary, you got night, the weather against you. What do you got in this one?
This pickup truck was traveling down this direction, apparently lost it on the curve. It came across the center of the road. Two vehicles impacted back here. We have gouge marks in the road, some scrape marks coming out to where this car ended up. And then the pickup truck rotates through the crash and ends up leaving these scrape marks to its position of final rest back here. Came over on the wrong side of the road on the curb, it looks like.
Well, you got some to work with. Good luck to you.
Gouges and scrape marks have clearly put the pickup truck in the wrong lane at the moment of impact, but that's only one factor in the crash. To determine if this was a criminal act, Lewis needs to know what would cause the driver to lose control. Why was there so much damage done to the Richards car? And how was anyone able to walk away from a scene of such destruction? A holiday celebration suddenly turns tragic for a middle-aged couple. Despite the heroic efforts of rescue workers to free them from their car and get them to the hospital, their work was in vain. Michael Richards is pronounced dead on arrival. His wife Sandy remains in critical condition. Inspector Gary Lewis has determined that their car actually went from traveling forward at 30 miles per hour to moving backwards in a fraction of a second. Unlike the driver of the pickup truck, the Richards experienced an almost instant change of direction that produced massive internal injuries. It's what police call a fatal delta V.
All right, delta V, the change of velocity for a given crash, is really a way of rating the severity of any car crash. We know it takes place over a certain fixed period of time. What we're defining with the term delta V, or change of speed, is how bad, the magnitude of that change over that little period of time. And that really leads us to an understanding of injury. For example, a car that's moving forward at some speed and is stopped in the collision and driven backwards has not only an increased change of speed compared to one that simply stops at a crash, but also exposes the occupants to a greater potential for injury. As the change of speed increases over a short period of time, folks get hurt worse and worse.
In other words, it's not direct impact with metal or glass that does so much damage to the Richards' bodies, but rather an instantaneous change in direction. This sudden shift puts catastrophic force on the heart and other organs. Massive internal bleeding usually follows, and this leads directly to Michael Richards' death. But the driver of the pickup is not nearly as vulnerable. His higher mass and greater speed at the time of collision keep his truck moving forward. Still, a collision at that speed is almost certain to cause multiple injuries and shock. The driver's life is also in grave danger. With the search on in earnest, Lewis gets two crucial pieces of information. A witness reports seeing the driver flee from the scene just moments after the collision. Another call to police reports a confrontation with the driver himself.
Hey, I'm almost ready. What?
Look, I got in a wreck and I might have killed someone. Look, I gotta go. Get off!
His name is Reggie Dowd, and he's not in good shape.
The co-owner of the truck made a phone call to the police and reported that her boyfriend had come to her house, taken her car, pretty much by force. He threatened her.
I don't know. He was limping, though. I don't know. He just came in here. He was limping. He said he might have killed someone. He took my keys, and then he left. No.
She also told the police that he was drunk, had been drinking, and that he was high and said he smoked crack cocaine. What we have is a person who's already been involved in one wreck and killed somebody with a vehicle. Now he has another vehicle and he's back out on the road again. It's like a murderer walking away with a murder weapon. He still has the weapon, he's still in the same condition he was, and he still has the potential to kill again.
In a situation like this, it would really help to know the extent of the driver's injuries. Does he need medical attention? Will he be looking for painkillers? Can he mask his injuries when he goes to see a doctor? Let's see if we can't help out. Thanks to the girlfriend, we know the driver's hurt. The question is, how bad? Well, we have ways of sorting that out. A dummy with a little paint reveals what typically happens to someone in a head-on crash. The seatbelts and airbags are going to work together to protect the head and upper torso, but they do that at the expense of the lower extremities. Knees and ankles are still going to be tangled up in the underside of the dash and the steering column. Look at that ankle. An injury like that, when you make contact with the floorboard or the brake pedal, it's going to hurt. If this dummy could talk, he'd probably be asking for more than aspirin.
As police continue to search for the injured Reggie Dowd, Gary Lewis returns to his office to examine each vehicle's SDM module. A vehicle's black box. It tells investigators how a car was driven up to 5 seconds before impact. From his analysis at the scene, Gary knows the pickup was speeding at the time of the crash. He hopes the SDM will explain how it ended up in the wrong lane, taking the life of Michael Richards.
We see that this vehicle was operated at 50 at impact, but 5 seconds prior to that was going 71 miles an hour. And the driver was actually on the brakes for the entire 5 seconds prior to the crash occurring. The visibility wasn't 5 seconds down the road on this particular stretch of road. It happened around a curve. So he wasn't reacting to the other car. He was hitting the brakes to save himself. This driver's operating recklessly without any regard for anybody else's safety or his own when he's that far over the speed limit on that type of roadway.
This is a critical finding for Gary. It concludes that the driver's actions were criminal, and the data can be used as evidence in court. The local hospital, on the lookout for suspicious leg injuries, notifies police that Reggie Dowd has shown up in the emergency room. Unable to endure the searing pain in his ankle, he finally comes out of hiding to seek some relief.
We had information he was going to show up at the hospital, and I met him there. His left leg was extremely swollen. The ankle and the knee were really swollen from injuries he got in this wreck.
'Cause 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 'c
Could you reveal your shoe, please?
His moods were just completely all over the board. He'd go from sad to almost crying to angry, ready to fight.
Reggie, you remember what happened?
He said that he'd been involved in the wreck, said he was driving his truck, but knew nothing else about it. Didn't remember anything else about this wreck, but admitted driving. And then decided he didn't want to say anything, and then the mood would go back to angry again. He didn't want to talk at all. Then he would almost say that he was sorry, and you'd see the tears about to start, but they never came.
Gary's in a tough spot here. He's got good physical evidence to work from. He has information from Reggie's girlfriend that suggests Reggie's condition's impaired, but she doesn't see him driving at the time of the crash. He's got injuries on Reggie. Reggie's injuries are consistent with the crash itself and the crash dynamics, but they need something more. So we have driving dynamics. We have the data from the reconstruction and the data recorder, and that tells us more about the crash. We can relate that to the injuries, but he's looking for that one last bit of evidence to tie Reggie back to this car and this crash. Suspicion's not enough. He's going to need something more.
One of the first things I thought was fingerprints. And then I realized, well, if it is his car, his fingerprints are everywhere. And I thought DNA, because it's the latest, greatest thing, even more definitive than fingerprints. So I thought, perfect, I'll get DNA. And then I realized, well, again, being his car, his DNA is everywhere. And then it hit me, except for one thing, or one place. And that is something that only comes out and only exposes itself in a violent wreck. The airbags of the vehicle. That airbag explodes right in front of your face. Your DNA is going to be deposited on it when you hit it, whether you want it to or not. Yours and nobody else's, unless there's two people in the car and they both happen to hit that bag. That was my best shot. I got a search warrant and seized that airbag and eventually got a match with the suspect's DNA.
With all of the information finally in hand, Gary can now give a full account of what happened on a dark December night in rural Maryland. Reggie Dowd was driving his pickup truck at over 60 miles an hour on a rain-slicked country road. Losing control on a corner, he applies his brakes and drifts into oncoming traffic, colliding with a car being driven by Sandy Richards. She and her husband suffer massive internal injuries when their car is instantly stopped by the impact and then hurtled backwards. Michael Richards is pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital, but his wife Sandy miraculously survives and eventually makes a full recovery. Despite Reggie Dowd's efforts to flee the scene and deny any involvement in the wreck, Gary Lewis was able to establish that Dowd was speeding at the time of impact, that he was in the wrong lane, and that he was ultimately the cause of the crash. Dowd eludes charges of driving while intoxicated, but indisputable DNA evidence leaves him little choice but to plead guilty to manslaughter by automobile and hit and run.
For Gary, this all came together as an application of technology. He used his at-scene work to figure out how fast the cars were going and how the people inside the cars moved. Then he used more technology. He used the DNA to figure out who was actually behind the wheel. And lastly, to get a picture of how this crash all came together, he used some information from the airbag control module that captured some pre-crash information. All of those together gave him an incredibly complete picture of this particular crash and led to 12 years for the driver. For a driver, seeing a pedestrian or seeing something in the road is not about visibility, it's about what's called conspicuity. Something has to stand out against the background in front of you. A lot of times, what that is movement. You don't necessarily see the pedestrian at first. What you see is movement ahead of you. When you see movement, you can react to it. You know, there's a lot of complications at night. One of those complications is oncoming headlights. It's amazing how much they can actually block.
Accountant Benjamin Davis is coming back from an office happy hour. He's worried because the gossip was all about company downsizing. It's a real distraction, and these SUV headlights coming at him don't help. Half a mile down the road on the side of the street, Miranda Smith is in a hurry to get back home after a tough 10-hour shift at work. She's almost there. She just has to cross the street and the vacant lot behind it. But fate has other deadlier plans. When Detective Andy Rich arrives at the crash site, Miranda's body is in the middle of the road. She's pronounced dead at the scene. There's only one thing he can do for her now, and that's to discover the exact circumstances that ended her life at just 18.
My main focus as a detective for the prosecutor's office is to determine if a crime has occurred. First thing I did was go to the police officers who were already on the scene just to get a basic feeling for what was going on. Okay, what happened?
The police officers tell him that it may be a hit and run. The victim certainly seems to have been struck by more than one vehicle. 3 witnesses claim the first vehicle to hit Miranda Smith was a van which then took off in a hurry. The driver of the SUV following the van claims the body came out of nowhere and fell onto his front hood after being struck. And there's another driver in the mix who says he had to steer his car around the body when it ended up in the opposing lane. Both drivers stopped while the van fled. There are a few versions of what happened, but there's only ever one version of the truth.
Accident investigators run into some complex and interesting cases, and this is one of them. So Andy's going to have to look at the physical evidence from the roadway, from the vehicle, from the bodies, and sort out what really happened using the objective information that doesn't have an interest in the case. Moreover, if it's a hit and run, time's working against him and he's got to work fast.
It was described as a van.
You guys put an alert on it?
Yes, we did. We already have an alert put out on it.
The search is on for the missing van, but at the scene, Andy Rich is concentrating on what the evidence can tell him. For all accident investigators, there is a simple rule of thumb.
Anytime 2 objects come in contact with each other, there's going to be a transfer of evidence. However, not in all cases are we going to find that physical evidence. In this case, we were lucky. There was a lot of physical evidence.
First, Andy has to determine whether or not the woman was hit in the first place, and if so, by which car and in what order.
My next step would be to go see the body and determine what type of injuries, at least on the outside, that I could see. See if they're consistent with motor vehicles. If this woman was hit by a car, how many different types of injuries am I going to see? For example, sliding along the ground, head contacts from windshields, and this way I can match up. For example, if I see glass in her hair, I want to see which vehicle has a fractured windshield.
Over the years, crash tests like this one help us better understand what happens when a pedestrian is hit by a car. Applying crash test data is the job of biomechanics experts like Judd Welcher. So Judd, what kind of injuries would you expect to see from a pedestrian hit by a car?
As you can see by the alignment of the bumper to your knee, the most common area of injury is down into the lower extremities. With the lower leg, you see damage to the knee structures, and as you get up to higher bumpers or shorter individual damage into the thigh and femur area. As the severity increases, the body will begin to hit further up onto the vehicle. You'll begin to get head contacts up into the hood structures and get severe injuries as you get further up into the windshield area.
Andy Rich sees signs of injuries just like those, but he doesn't yet know which vehicle hit her or how many times she was struck. His findings here will be critical as they could lead to jail time for one or both of these drivers. Andy's first move is to talk to the driver of the car.
So you want to go back to your car, meet the officer over there?
Benjamin Davis says he didn't see the teenager getting hit by any other vehicle.
Come with me.
He says the body just appeared in the middle of his lane, and he barely missed it by swerving hard.
I swear, I mean, she like jumped out at me. I barely missed her. I was just going, I was listening.
The driver of the car told Dad he didn't hit the woman at all.
Rich needs to check out Davis's story. First, he takes another look at the body to see if it can offer up additional clues, and it does. He finds a colored smudge on the woman's sneaker that looks very similar to the color of Davis's car. His next stop is the car's rear end.
When I looked at the car, I found what I believed to be blood stains in front of the rear wheel. I also found bloody tire prints, 4 of them, led from the body to where the car parked. It appeared just on its face that this vehicle had contact with the body. But just to make sure, I measured the distance between each tire print and calculated what the radius of the tire would be that left. It looked like that tire from the car made those 4 prints. Also, the tire treads, the pattern, appeared to be consistent with what we saw on the roadway.
A good accident investigator has to cover all the bases. Even though some red substance may look like blood, Andy's got to be sure. So he's going to run what's called a Castle-Meyer test on the roadway and the bumper of the car. To do a Castle-Meyer test, you have to mix together 2 basic chemicals, phenylsaline and hydrogen peroxide. You get a wet swab, you get it wet with distilled water, and rub it over your suspect stain. Put the chemicals in contact with that swab, and if it turns pink, you have a positive test, meaning that it's actually blood.
The test proves positive. It is blood. It's clear now that Benjamin Davis did not tell the truth.
I just tested your car. It's got her blood on it. You have something you want to tell me? I pretty much just approached him and told him, I know you're lying, that we had tire prints leading from the body to his car, and that we tested the surface of his car, and it tested positive for blood. So we knew that his vehicle came into contact with the body, at which point the driver admitted that the body bounced into his car.
What happened, sir?
The body landed on my hood.
Okay,
While Davis is changing his story to Andy Rich, the driver of the SUV is telling a police officer his version of what happened.
what
The
happened?
body fell on my hood. The van hit her.
His story was he was just driving along, going westbound, when the body dropped in on him out of thin air. And his story was that another car had hit him first, projected the body up into the air, and then it landed on his car. Any news about that van?
But there's still no sign of any missing van. In fact, there's no evidence at the scene that there ever was a van at all. Only the statements of witnesses who say they saw one.
We were unable to find any parts from another vehicle. I started doubting then that there was actually another vehicle.
If it turns out there was no van, it's either the car or the SUV that hit the teenager first. Rich is still trying to figure that out. But more than that, he's working on the how and why she was hit in the first place. The life of a bright 18-year-old named Miranda Smith has come to a tragic and sudden end on a busy roadway. She was hit by at least 2 vehicles, a car and an SUV. Each driver is pointing the finger of guilt at a mysterious van that fled the scene after hitting the girl. Accident investigator Andy Rich is starting to piece this story together, and he's pretty sure there was no van involved. He knows the driver of the car is a proven liar. Now what he wants to do is figure out if the driver of the SUV has a better grip on the truth.
Robert Johnson says he was simply driving home in his SUV after a visit to a friend's apartment. He claims he was behind a van when, out of the blue, a body landed on the hood of his SUV. He stopped and saw the van zoom away. Rich turns to examine the SUV. Soon enough, he finds a mark made by the young victim's clothes. But it's not on the hood of the SUV. It's somewhere much more telling.
And I found fiber weave impressions on the bumper. There's a pattern left on the car, normally in the surface of the paint. There's no mistaking it for being produced by a set of blue jeans. And we look at the angle that the fabric weave impressions were, and it was consistent with somebody standing.
That means for the van to have hit Miranda Smith first, she would have had to land on her feet in front of the SUV before getting hit again. An almost impossible scenario. After 5 hours of investigation, Rich is now almost certain there was never a van and that the SUV hit the young woman first, but he needs more proof. The next major piece of the puzzle will come with the results of Miranda Smith's autopsy. So Andy wastes no time getting down to the morgue for a consultation with medical examiner Dr. Marianne Clayton.
Hi, Doc.
Hi, Andy.
I need to figure out whether she was standing when she was hit.
Well, I would say so. She's got the typical upright pedestrian group of injuries. First off, she's got a lethal head injury, impact left forehead, pretty extensive skull fracture pattern under that. And she's got your classic bumper fracture, the left lower leg.
How high is that fracture?
17 inches.
Okay, it's exactly the height of the guy's bumper.
Great. Good correlation.
Thank you. Prosecutor's office.
Dr. Clayton's report confirms Andy's working theory. The lethal head wound is consistent with a windshield strike to a standing pedestrian. Likewise, the broken fibula bone shows that Miranda's legs were virtually cut out from under her by a fast-moving vehicle, exactly the same height as Robert Johnson's SUV.
After his visit to the medical examiner's office, Andy had the SUV towed to this garage. He wants to eliminate the hit-and-run scenario once and for all. Evidence from the fiber weave on the bumper and injuries to her body show that Miranda Smith was hit by the SUV while she was standing. Now he'll examine the blood spatter on the SUV. That may turn out to be the most revealing evidence of all.
If we look up in here at these blood stains, you see that they all have directionality. It's a blood drop that has a tail to it. And if we look at all of these tails and we trace the directionality of each of these blood stains, we'll see that they all converge at this windshield wiper spindle here. And you can see where the hair is deposited. This tells me that the woman's head had come into contact with this windshield wiper spindle. And then the blood sprayed up in this direction, causing these stains. What we don't see is any indications that the body could have just dropped in from the sky, for example, getting hit by a vehicle first and then falling in. If that were the case, we would see a nice circular drop of blood without any of the tails. Since that's not here, we could pretty much eliminate that this body just dropped in.
The witnesses say there was a van, but the physical evidence proves without a doubt that this was simply not the case.
In a serious accident like this, the witness is first getting very much bombarded with emotions. Their emotions are heightening. As a byproduct of that, their perceptions are decreasing because it is a different part of your brain that incorporates emotions than what incorporates thought processes. So as your emotions heighten, your thought process actually become disorganized.
The circumstances surrounding Amanda Smith's death are now clear to Andy Rich. First, she was struck by Robert Johnson's SUV, a collision that whipped Miranda's legs out from under her and flung her head first into the windshield. The body was then thrown into the opposite lane, where it was hit by Benjamin Davis's car. But there is still something bothering Andy. He needs to know why Robert Johnson didn't see the woman. After all, she was in the middle of the road, and there's no indication of swerving or braking. This is a key question because it could determine whether Johnson's actions were reckless and if criminal charges should be filed.
My main focus as a detective for the prosecutor's office is to determine if a crime has occurred. I asked him if he had his headlights on, if they were working, and he said they were on and working. But that's not enough. We need to go to the physical evidence to see what the real truth is.
Hey, Andy, what do you got?
I'm looking at these light bulbs here. I want to see if this guy had his headlights on or not at the time of the crash. So this is the marker light. There's a light on the side of the car. And I'm looking at the filament here, and it looks like we got some hot shock. This one is stretched out, so this is telling me that this light was on at the time of the collision. So let's go a step further and look at the headlight. Okay, this is unexpected here. We're looking at some cold break here.
So that suggests this one was off.
Right. This headlight was off, but yet we had a marker light on. Normally, you're both going to have them both on or off.
So we've got one light on and one light off.
Right.
Even though the driver told Rich that the SUV's headlights were fully on, the evidence says otherwise. Next, the investigator needs to determine if it was a case of driver error or if there was a problem with the electrical circuit.
This van had, in the automotive industry, what they call a multifunction switch. Now, when you rotate this switch one click, it turns the parking lights on. When you rotate it a second click, it puts on the headlights. So what must have happened in this case, since the circuits were working properly, is the driver only put the parking lights on. He only turned that multifunction switch one click.
After 7 hours, Andy Rich has established exactly how Miranda Smith was hit and killed. Andy Rich concludes that Robert Johnson didn't see the young woman until it was too late, for 2 specific reasons. 1, the headlights of his SUV were not on. 2, he was blinded by the oncoming headlights of Benjamin Davis's car.
In the end, no criminal charges were actually filed. Both drivers tried to get themselves out of any potential blame by making up parts of their stories. While that may not be a crime, it's not exactly honest either. And it made Andy Rich's job a lot more difficult. There are a number of reasons for pedestrian crashes. On the pedestrian side, wearing dark clothing and entering where there's not enough light or where a driver wouldn't expect you is not a good idea. On the driver's side, there's distractions, there's oncoming headlights, a number of different reasons a driver may not readily see the pedestrian entering the road. One last thing that driver can do, though, is make sure the lights are turned on all the way. But for the turn of a switch, this pedestrian would still be alive.
Next, investigators trying to solve a single vehicle crash that killed a father of 3 make a startling discovery at the scene, one that dramatically alters the course of their investigation.
Sharp steering maneuver right and left at low speed, not a big deal, you can recover from it. At high speeds, with the buildup of lateral friction, that might be a little tougher to deal with. In Toronto, we have a single vehicle rollover that looks like it came from such a maneuver, some sort of steering input. Investigators there are trying to figure out why.
Someone here? Anyone in a vehicle?
A 911 call leads police to an overturned car on a busy Ontario freeway. The first officer on the scene confirms the worst. The driver has been ejected. His body, crushed after being torn from the vehicle during the crash, lies over 60 feet away from what remains of his car. The police soon confirm the identity of the victim. His name is Paul Taylor, a local father of 3 who left home early this morning, hoping to avoid any heavy traffic heading into the city. Brad Muir is a senior reconstructionist with the Ontario Provincial Police. He leads a team of investigators who respond to fatal crashes on some of the area's most heavily traveled expressways. Their job is to solve a mystery. Why did this car suddenly roll over? And who or what was at fault? A single vehicle crash is the most difficult scenario they face. They offer few clues to help investigators determine what went wrong.
When I first came on scene, I was confronted with this vehicle that was rolled over on its roof, partly on the roadway, partly on the shoulder. And it was obvious to me that he had rolled over, and I saw that because as I was walking down the asphalt, there was an area of scraping where the vehicle was on its roof and some paint transferred onto the road, broken glass from one of the windows that shattered upon impact when he rolled over. And, I had to look at this vehicle, and there's no obvious cause on the roadway of why this vehicle rolled over. I had to get down and have a closer look at the vehicle for any damage or something that might have caused him to wind up where he did.
Brad and his team have just showed up on a rollover crash. You've got somebody ejected, they're dead. And the problem with that is you can survive rollover crashes with a simple fix. That would be seatbelts. Seatbelts keep you in the car protects you in the rollover. That's an easy fix. Unfortunately, folks don't take advantage of that, and in rollovers they get killed. Now, these guys have got an interesting crash. They've got a very limited amount of evidence to work with, one vehicle on scene. We don't know if the guy was asleep at the wheel, was run off the road. What happened, they're gonna have to sort out, and they'll do it with what little they have to work with right now.
Rollovers are extremely violent events. If this one was caused by a mechanical failure, it would be an easy thing to spot, but nothing stands out. Instead, It appears as if this car just suddenly became airborne at 50 miles per hour and began tumbling down the road. A survey of the wreck offers little to investigators until Brad Muir discovers an odd stain on the back bumper.
Well, looking at the back bumper of the vehicle, I noticed there is a paint transfer and some paint chips on the back of the bumper. Now, a vehicle of that age, and of course in a city, it's not always the smoking gun. There's a lot of cars just walking through any parking lot. You'll see scuffs and scrapes on their bumpers. It's a matter of trying, if you can, to isolate what would constitute fresh damage or fresh transfer versus something that's been there for a while. It can be very difficult sometimes depending on the age of the vehicle.
Fresh damage would suggest that another car was involved in this crash. Paint can be transferred from one car to another on impact, but only further tests back at the lab can confirm this suspicion. Given the extent of the damage, Brad concludes that the vehicle was moving at high speed, and therefore it took several seconds to come to a stop. Whatever caused the driver to lose control took place at least 1,000 feet up the road.
So you got a pretty good crash scene here. What have you got?
Well, I've worked about 1,000 feet back up the road, and I have a lot of nothing at the moment, just some evidence from this car where it rolled over and some scrapings off the back bumper.
Everything else is pretty much gathered in this scene here, and that's all from this car.
So far in here, it's all from this car. I have nothing that indicates to me another vehicle was involved.
After an exhaustive survey of the crash scene, Bureau opts to search for more evidence further down the road beyond the original point of impact, and what he discovers dramatically alters the course of the investigation.
When I walk down the road and I start to see, a puddle of antifreeze or engine coolant on the roadway, that could just be a rat hose letting go. But then when you couple that with some broken car parts in the same area right adjacent to it, it's not any one of those things by itself. But when you couple all those three things together, now I'm on the right trail. Now I'm pretty much, I've got to fail to remain here, and I need to investigate this further and see if I can identify that other vehicle that's no longer in my scene.
Brad Muir's team has solved one mystery but are now faced with another. Evidence gathered at the scene tells them a car that rolled over and ejected its driver was actually struck by another car. Investigators now realize they are in a race against time to find a driver who has caused one fatality and may still be behind the wheel. They may only have a matter of hours before this driver disappears into a sea of commuters and is lost to them forever.
Yeah. No, I'm on my way there now.
Paul Taylor, a 36-year-old advertising writer, is cruising along in the early morning hours hoping to avoid rush hour traffic into the city. Instead, the father of three finds himself in a terrifying rollover that starts when he is bumped by another car. Evidence found at the roadside tells police the other car may have stopped briefly before fleeing the scene. 20% of all accidents are hit and runs, and it usually means a driver has been in trouble before. But the shock and stress of being involved in a crash can have profound effects on even the most responsible driver.
Is it possible to make poor judgment during a panic attack? The question is a good one, because research shows us that when we're in panic or in a heightened state of anxiety, our emotional response bypasses our thinking brain. We have a very old and primitive part of our brain called the limbic system that responds to fear. And that part of your brain is designed for survival. It's not designed to make good decisions or do any problem solving in difficult situations, which is why people often say they can't think clearly when they're in a panic situation. Basically, at that moment, it's as if your mind is saying to your body, you're in danger, get out of here, and get out of here quick.
Brad Muir returns to his office with a few specks of black paint, a few drops of antifreeze, and some pieces of plastic. It might not sound like much, but to an investigator, it's almost as good as a footprint.
Well, I've got a gray piece of a headlight. It's the backing to a reflector lens for a headlight. And it's got what appears to be a part number for a General Motors vehicle. It's got the prefix GM, which indicates to me General Motors. R for right, so I know it's a right-hand headlight. And it's got what looks to be an 8-digit part number on here, which I should be able to nail down to a particular line of General Motors vehicles.
It's a lucky break, and within a few minutes, Brad Muir knows exactly what type of GM car initiated the deadly rollover crash that killed Paul Taylor.
If you think about what Brad and his team have been able to accomplish in such a short period of time, it's pretty amazing. That's what good accident investigators do. They've taken the evidence from the scene, and from that, been able to sort out not only the make and model of the car, but also its color. Now they're going to turn to us for help. Brad's given the details of the investigation to the media. They're going to flood the airwaves with this information, and by the end of the afternoon, instead of just a couple hundred police cars looking for the driver, we'll have a couple million pairs of eyes peeled.
Taking no chances that this car might slip off the radar, investigators also put the word out to repair shops and dealerships in the area to report any driver seeking repairs to a damaged radiator and a right front headlight.
Check underneath. There's some sort of green stuff leaking.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem.
Great, here you go, thanks.
Less than 24 hours after arriving on the scene of a fatal rollover, Brad Muir is called to a garage that suspects they may have the car that initiated the crash. Margaret Dorr's vehicle undergoes a quick inspection in the garage. The telltale signs of damage Muir had anticipated are enough to secure a warrant to seize the car and to examine its SDM module, or black box recorder.
I downloaded the airbag control module known as the SDM, or Sensing Diagnostic Module, for this vehicle. It had a bit of an event data recorder portion where it recorded some information for the bullet car, or the striking vehicle. And that really helped me because it showed that the driver of that car underwent a change of speed of about 7 miles per hour over about 1/10 of a second. 7 miles per hour doesn't sound like a lot, but over that little time period, it was certainly a significant impact for the driver of that vehicle. And it really settled in my mind that she had to know that she had hit somebody, because 7 miles per hour in 1/10 of a second, that's a significant bump for her.
With the final piece of the puzzle in place, Rusty and Brad can now replay the fatal chain of events. For Paul Taylor, it should have been another routine commute into the city. Arriving early into work allowed him free time in the afternoons to help coach his eldest son's soccer team. But shortly after he enters the freeway, a car driven by Margaret Dorr comes up from behind fast. It makes contact with Taylor's rear bumper while attempting to pass. The impact immediately causes his rear wheels to lose contact with the ground, sending him spinning to the right. When his wheels touch back down, they dig into the asphalt and hurl the car onto its side, sending it rolling thousands of feet past the point of impact. Unfortunately, Paul Taylor is not wearing a seatbelt. In an instant, he is launched out through the driver's side window and into the ditch. He dies from severe trauma to the head and massive internal bleeding. Margaret Dorr, on the way into the city to take her final college exams, flees the scene. But Brad Muir discovers crucial roadway evidence and builds a dragnet that eventually lands her in court. Margaret Dorr's clean driving record helps convince a judge that her poor judgment was not malicious. Instead of the 5-year maximum penalty, she is handed a 90-day sentence and her license is suspended for 1 year. The fact that investigators were forced to track her down after the crash still baffles Brad Muir.
For some reason, she just decided to fail to remain and took off, and essentially turned what might have been a minor infraction, Highway Traffic Act regulatory violation, into this criminal fail to remain. I struggle at times trying to understand the human nature side of what motivates people to just take off and leave somebody else in the ditch like that.
There are a couple of things we take away from this crash. First, it has to do with closing speed. A car overtaking another one in a parking lot at a low speed, let's say 10 miles an hour, doesn't leave much of a post-impact scene. The crash scene's relatively compact. Now change that out into the highway where you have 60 overtaking 50, and you have to bring those cars to a stop at some point. Have a lot bigger crash scene after the actual car-to-car impact, and a lot of times that can have disastrous results. The other thing we take away from this crash has to do with good investigative technique and a little bit of forensic evidence. Here, Brad did a great job taking little bits and pieces from the cars and brought it all together to solve a hit and run in a relatively short period of time.